The February wind cut through Wren Bellamy's threadbare coat like it carried a personal grudge against every poor woman foolish enough to walk 11 miles through Montana Territory snow. She clutched her mother's sewing kit to her chest, the leather handle worn smooth by 2 generations of desperate hands, and she kept walking because stopping meant dying, and dying meant letting her mother down. And Wren Bellamy had made a promise on a deathbed that she intended to keep. She was 21 years old, orphaned, broke, 1 week from eviction at Mrs. Hinton's boarding house in Cedar Flats, where the rent was $3 a month and the landlady's patience had run out 2 weeks ago. Her mother had died that autumn slowly and expensively, the consumption eating through her lungs and their savings with equal efficiency. The medical bills swallowed everything. The funeral took what remained, and the creditors who had been circling like wolves since her father's death 3 years prior closed in with the enthusiasm of men who smelled blood in winter. Her father, Owen Bellamy, had been a farmer, not a good one, a dreamer who signed loans he couldn't repay and trusted bankers who smiled while sharpening their knives. He died under a collapsed barn roof during a storm, and the bank took the farm before the dirt on his grave had settled. Wren was 18 then. She moved her sick mother into the boarding house, took every sewing job Cedar Flats could offer, and learned the arithmetic of poverty, how to stretch a dollar across 6 days, how to eat every other meal without anyone noticing, how to mend her own clothes. So many times the patches had patches. Her mother's last words whispered from a sickbed that smelled of camphor and surrender had been simple. Survive, Wren. No matter what it costs you, find a way to survive. So she walked 11 miles through a February blizzard because someone in town had mentioned the Kincaid Ranch needed mending done, and mending was the one thing Wren Bellamy could do better than anyone in the territory. She had no horse, no money for a wagon. She had 2 feet a pair of leaking boots and the kind of stubbornness that only grows in women who have buried everyone they ever loved. She did not know the Kincaids were hosting an engagement party that night. She did not know that 300 guests from across Montana and the Dakotas had descended on the estate for what was supposed to be the social event of the decade. She did not know that walking through the servants' entrance of the Kincaid estate would change every single thing about her miserable, beautiful, stubborn life. She knew none of this. She only knew that her feet hurt. Her stomach had been empty since yesterday morning, and the warm light spilling from the mansion's windows looked like something from a world she had only ever read about in newspapers she couldn't afford to buy. The servants' entrance was unlocked. Wren slipped inside, brushed snow from her shoulders, and immediately realized her mistake. The hallway opened into the edge of a ballroom, blazing with the kind of wealth that made her chest physically ache. Crystal chandeliers threw rainbow light across silk gowns that cost more than her father's entire annual income in his best year. Men in tailored suits smoked cigars thick as her wrists, discussing railroad expansions and territorial politics like they were commenting on the weather. Women in imported lace laughed in clusters, their jewelry catching light like small, expensive fires. The air was thick with French perfume, cigar smoke, champagne, and the arrogance of people who had never once in their comfortable lives wondered where their next meal was coming from. Wren tried to back out. She turned toward the door she had entered, already composing the apologies she would give to empty air, already calculating the miles back through the snow and whether she could make it before the storm worsened or her legs gave out, whichever came first. Too late. A hand clamped around her arm. Thick fingers. Whiskey breath so strong it made her eyes water from 3 inches away. Well, well. The voice was loud enough to carry across half the ballroom, spoken with the theatrical cruelty of a man who had never learned the difference between entertainment and humiliation. Look what wandered in from the cold. Prescott Kemp was 28 years old, the only son of Senator Kemp from Helena, and drunk enough to confuse cruelty with charm. He was tall, soft through the middle from a life lived entirely without consequence, with the small, mean eyes of a man who had discovered early that his father's name was a weapon he could swing at anyone without penalty. His grip on Wren's arm tightened when she tried to pull away, and something in his expression shifted from amusement to something uglier. Please, sir. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. I am just looking for the housekeeper. I was told there might be seamstress work available. Seamstress work. Prescott laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking on marble. That is what girls like you call it now. Show up at rich men's parties and rush hoping some fool mistakes you for quality. Heat flooded Wren's face. Something hotter than embarrassment, something closer to rage, but she swallowed it because rage was a luxury she could not afford. Every conversation in their section of the ballroom had died. Heads turned. Eyes evaluated her threadbare coat, her mud-caked boots, the sewing kit she clutched like a shield, the desperation she could not disguise no matter how straight she held her spine. A woman in emeralds whispered something behind her fan to a companion who snickered. Two men near the champagne tower exchanged the kind of look that said they had already decided what Ren was and what she deserved. She had faced poverty before. She had faced hunger and cold and debt collectors pounding on her door before dawn. She had faced the cruelty of shopkeepers who extended credit and then demanded payment they knew she could not make. But this public dissection, this casual savagery from people who had never struggled a single day in their pampered lives was something different. It was not pain, it was erasure. 200 people looked at Ren Bellamy and decided she was nothing, and the collective weight of their judgment pressed against her throat like a hand. Let go of me. Her voice came out stronger than she expected, surprising even herself. Or what? Prescott leaned closer and the whiskey on his breath could have stripped paint. You will run back to whatever dirt hole you crawled out of, back to whatever sad little shack you call home. The words hung in the perfumed air. 200 people watched in diamond-studded silence, and not one of them, not a single soul in that glittering room full of money and power and fine breeding, moved to help her. Then a voice cut through the shame like a blade forged in winter. Take your hand off her. Now. Every person in that ballroom knew the voice. It belonged to Everett Kincaid, and hearing it was like watching a cold front move across open land. Silent, absolute. The temperature in the room dropped, and it had nothing to do with the February wind outside. Everett was 33 years old, and he was built from the same raw material as the mountain country he had run since his father's death 4 years ago. Tall, broad through the shoulder in the way of men who split their own wood and hauled their own timber. His face was hard carved by weather and grief into planes and angles that gave nothing away, and his eyes were the pale blue of winter sky over granite peaks. Those eyes could freeze a man mid-sentence. They could make a banker stammer. They could silence a room of 300 people with a single look, which is exactly what they did now. He crossed the ballroom floor with the walk of a man who owned the ground beneath him, not because of money, but because he had bled, for it worked it with his hands buried his father in it. The crowd parted for him, not out of courtesy, out of instinct. Behind him, two men followed, not servants, not guests. Brothers. Levi Kincaid came next, 27. Lighter than Everett in both build and temperament, with the same blue eyes but none of the frost. Where Everett moved like a storm approaching, Levi moved like the quiet before one easy and watchful, a half-smile resting on his face that could disarm even the most hostile stranger. He was the ranch's horse trainer, known across 3 territories for his ability to gentle even the most broken, most dangerous stallion. People said Levi Kincaid could calm anything except his older brother's temper. But it was his eyes that told the real story right now. They tracked Prescott Kemp's hand on Ren's arm with sharp, focused attention, and the half-smile on his face had gone very, very still. Briar Kincaid brought up the rear, 24, the youngest and the most immediately dangerous. He was the ranch's blacksmith, and his body showed it in ways that required no explanation. Arms thick from years at the forge, hands that could bend iron bar stock without leverage. A scar across his left eyebrow from a saloon fight he had won at 17, the kind of scar that served as a permanent warning to anyone considering their chances. His face carried none of Levi's warmth and all of Everett's hardness, but where Everett's coldness was calculated, Briar's was combustible. He was already positioning himself between Prescott Kemp and the nearest exit, cutting off retreat, with the casual precision of a man who had been in enough fights to know exactly how they ended. Prescott released Ren's arm but held his ground, emboldened by alcohol, in the belief that his father's name was a shield that could stop anything, even Everett Kincaid. Just having fun with the help, Kincaid. No harm meant. The help. Everett repeated the words slowly, the way a man might repeat the name of a poison, to make sure he remembered exactly what it was called. He looked at Ren then, really looked at her. Not at the threadbare coat or the muddy boots or the sewing kit, at her eyes. And something shifted in his expression, a flicker behind the control that moved too fast for anyone else to catch. Calculation, recognition of an opportunity. The exact moment a desperate, reckless, possibly insane plan formed in a mind that had been searching for a way out for 6 months and had just been handed one by a girl who walked through a blizzard for $2 a week. "You are mistaken," Everett said quietly. The quiet was worse than shouting. Everyone in that room understood this instinctively. Mercer Voss, the railroad magnate, whose daughter Everett was supposed to marry within the hour, pushed through the crowd. He was 56 years old, thick-necked, with the red complexion of a man whose blood pressure and temper were in constant competition. He had been planning this wedding for 18 months. He had spent $40,000 on this party alone. And he was looking at Everett Kincaid with the expression of a man watching his entire investment walk off a cliff. "Kincaid, what is the meaning of this?" "The ceremony begins in 40 minutes. Everett ignored him completely. He took Wren's hand. The one Prescott Kemp had bruised. His grip was firm but careful, the way a man holds something he has decided to protect, and his thumbs settled across her knuckles with a steadiness that contradicted everything about the chaos erupting around them. "Ladies, gentlemen," he raised his voice to fill the ballroom. Every word precise, every syllable was deliberate. "I apologize for the confusion tonight. There will not be a wedding." Mercer Voss made a sound like a bull that had been shot but hadn't yet realized it was dying. "You cannot be serious. We have a contract. A binding legal agreement signed by your father. Contracts can be broken." Everett's thumb traced a single line across Wren's knuckles. She felt it in her fingertips, her chest, the base of her spine, a current that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with two desperate people recognizing in each other the same willingness to gamble everything on a single moment, especially when a man discovers his priorities have changed. Change for what exactly? Mercer's lawyer materialized at his elbow, a thin, sharp man named Aldrich Crane, whose eyes moved like a predator, scanning for weakness. "You are throwing away a $50,000 merger, political connections that reach Washington, and a legal obligation your own father signed. For what?" Everett pulled Wren closer. She could smell leather and pine smoke and iron filings from the forge, the scent of men who work their own land with their own hands. "For our wife," he said. "Our." The word detonated across the ballroom like blasting powder in a mine shaft. It did not echo. It exploded, and the shrapnel hit every person in that room. Mercer Voss's daughter screamed from somewhere behind the crowd. A serving tray crashed to the marble floor, champagne glasses shattering like small, expensive bombs. Two railroad investors started shouting about breach of contract. The string quartet stopped mid-note, their bows frozen above their instruments. A woman in pearls fainted, though that may have been the champagne rather than the shock. And Wren Bellamy, who had walked through Montana Territory snow hoping for seamstress work, stood at the center of a catastrophe she did not understand, her hand locked in the grip of the most powerful and most dangerous man in the territory, a ring of expensive chaos spinning around her while 300 people lost their collective minds. But it was not just Everett's grip she felt. Levi had moved to her other side, and his hand came to rest on her shoulder with a naturalness that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before. Warm, steady. An anchor in the storm his brother had just created. And Breyer stood behind all three of them, his weight shifted onto his back foot, and his jaw set facing the crowd with an expression that dared anyone in the room to take a single step closer. Three brothers, presenting a united front, claiming one woman. In Montana Territory in 1883, this was not unheard of. In remote mountain communities where women were scarce and winters lasted 7 months, and survival demanded the kind of cooperation that polite society preferred not to acknowledge, brothers sometimes shared a household and a wife. It was whispered about in drawing rooms and condemned from church pulpits and quietly practiced in valleys where the nearest neighbor was a full day's ride away and a single pair of hands was never enough to keep a family alive through January. The arrangement was called mountain marriage by those who lived it and mountain shame by those who did not. And Everett Kincaid had just announced 1 to 300 of Montana's most influential and most gossiping citizens. "Play along," Everett murmured, his voice so low that only Wren could hear it beneath the uproar. "Unless you want that man to finish what he started." Wren glanced at Prescott Kemp, who was staring at her with the look of a man assembling ammunition. Then at Levi, whose warm eyes held an apology and a plea wrapped together. Then at Briar, whose dark expression said one thing clearly: we protect what is ours. I do not understand, she whispered. You will. 5 minutes. Upstairs. Can you hold it together for 5 minutes? Every survival instinct Ren Bellamy possessed told her to run. But something else, something forged in too many years of powerlessness and closed doors, and men like Prescott Kemp who believed they owned the world, made her straighten her spine and lift her chin and look Everett Kincaid directly in his eyes. Yes, she said. They climbed the grand staircase together, all four of them, moving as a unit while chaos consumed the ballroom below. Mercer Voss's voice thundered about lawsuits and ruined alliances. His daughter's sobs echoed through the halls. Investors argued about damages and liability. Aldrich Crane scribbled notes with the focused intensity of a lawyer who already smelled blood in the water. Everett said nothing until they reached the second floor. He led Wren down a hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-faced Kincaid men, 3 generations of hard jaws and harder eyes looking down from gilded frames, and opened a heavy oak door into a study that smelled of leather tobacco and old books. A fire burned in the grate. The room was warm after the bitter cold outside, and Wren felt the contrast hit her exhausted body like a physical blow. Levi entered behind them and closed the door softly. Briar leaned his shoulder against it, making it unmistakably clear that the conversation about to take place would not be interrupted by anyone. Then Everett released her hand and stepped back. The warmth left his expression like heat leaving iron pulled from the forge. I need to know one thing before we continue, he said. His voice had changed. The tenderness from the ballroom was gone. This was business. This was a man who ran 4,000 acres and 200 head of cattle and made decisions that affected 30 employees every single day. Can you keep a secret that could destroy all of our lives? Wren's legs buckled. She sank into the nearest chair, her sewing kit tumbling from her arms to the floor, needles and thread and measuring tape scattering across polished hardwood. What did you just do down there? Saved you from a man who was about to humiliate you in front of every person of consequence in Montana territory. Saved ourselves from a political prison that has been closing around us for the better part of a year. Everett moved to a sideboard and poured whiskey. 4 glasses. Automatic. The way a man pours when he has always poured 4. He offered her one. She took it with both hands because one hand alone could not keep the glass steady. The question is whether you are desperate enough to help us make it real. He explained it with brutal efficiency that left no room for sentiment. His father, Robert Kincaid, and Mercer Voss had been friends once. 30 years ago, they had pioneered the Cedar Flats Valley together, building homesteads side by side, surviving their first Montana winter in dugout shelters while blizzards tried to kill them. But Voss had moved into railroads and political power, and over the decades, his ambition had curdled into something darker. He wanted the Kincaid water rights, the only source strong enough to supply a railroad water station on the transcontinental route through Montana. Robert Kincaid refused to sell. Voss waited, patiently, the way a predator waits. When Robert Kincaid fell ill with the cancer that would kill him, Voss arrived at his bedside with a proposal that looked like salvation: marry his daughter Laurel to Everett, and in exchange, Voss would erase the $20,000 in bank debt that 3 consecutive years of drought had piled on the ranch like stones on a grave. Robert signed. He was dying and desperate and terrified that his sons would lose everything he had spent his life building. He did not read the fine print. He did not see the clauses buried deep in the marriage contract clauses that would transfer control of the water rights to Voss's railroad company within 2 years of the wedding. Clauses that would eventually give Voss control of the entire ranch. Everett discovered those clauses 3 months ago. He hired lawyers, consulted judges, explored every legal avenue available to a man trying to escape a contract signed by his dead father. The answer was always the same. The contract was airtight, unbreakable, binding, unless Everett was already married, in which case the engagement clause became void and the entire arrangement collapsed. 6 months I have been looking for a way out, Everett said. Every door, every angle, nothing worked. And then you walked in, Briar said from the door. 3 words, flat and factual. The summary of a miracle delivered in the tone of a weather report. Wren stared at them. The whiskey burned her empty stomach, but it steadied her hands. You are asking me to pretend to be your wife, all three of you, for 1 year. Everett pulled a document from his desk drawer. Even in the middle of the greatest crisis of his life, he had prepared paperwork. The realization that he had been carrying this contingency plan, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, told Wren more about Everett Kincaid than any conversation ever could. You live here as our wife. You appear with us in public as needed. You maintain the story convincingly enough to survive legal scrutiny. There are rules, Everett continued, and something in his voice hardened further. No emotional involvement. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. No questions about our past. We will not ask about yours, and absolutely no real intimacy of any kind. We share public spaces as necessary to maintain appearances. Private lives remain completely separate. You will have your own room, Levi said, quickly stepping forward with the earnestness of a man who needed her to understand this point above all others. Your own wing, actually. 17 guest rooms on the west side. No one enters without your permission. That is sacred. And if anyone makes you uncomfortable, Breyer said, his voice carrying an edge that made the words sound less like a promise and more like a threat directed at the entire world, anyone at all you tell us, we handle it. In exchange, Levi continued, pulling a folder of financial documents from the desk, we erase whatever debts brought you to our door. We set you up with your own seamstress establishment in town, and we provide $10,000 in cash, enough to start over anywhere in the country. $10,000. The number hit Wren like a physical force. $10,000 was more money than her father had earned in his entire life. It was freedom, a shop of her own, a life without hunger, a future that did not end in a boarding house with a cruel landlady, and empty pockets in the slow grinding death of every dream she had ever held. You are insane, she said, all three of you. Probably, Everett agreed, but we are also your best option right now. And he was right. Wren understood this with the cold, clear logic of a woman who had spent 3 years calculating survival odds. In approximately 5 minutes, Aldrich Crane would begin investigating whether this marriage was legitimate. If he proved fraud, Wren would face criminal charges alongside all three brothers. If she left now, walked out of this room, and back into the snow, she would be branded across the territory as a confidence woman who had tried to trap Montana's richest ranchers. Her name would be mud. Her reputation would be ash. No one in Cedar Flats or anywhere within 200 miles would hire her to mend a dish rag, let alone a dress. She was trapped. But the trap had gold walls and warm fires and 3 men offering her more money than she had ever imagined. And the alternative was miles of blizzard in a boarding house that was already preparing to throw her out. What do I have to do first? She asked. The tension in the room cracked. Everett's shoulders dropped half an inch, and for just a moment, Wren saw something behind the control in his eyes that looked like relief so intense it bordered on collapse. Levi exhaled audibly. Breyer nodded once sharp and final, the way a man closes a deal he was not entirely sure would close. Put on this ring, Everett said, opening a small velvet box from the top desk drawer. Inside, a gold band set with 3 small diamonds caught the firelight. 3 stones, one for each brother. It had belonged to their grandmother, a woman who had survived the frontier alongside a husband, and according to family history, told in whispers his brother, come downstairs with us. Look Mercer Voss in the eye and convince him you are exactly where you want to be. Wren held out her left hand. Everett slid the ring onto her finger. It fit. She did not know why this detail mattered, but it did. Something passed between them when his skin touched hers, something that had nothing to do with romance or attraction, and everything to do with 2 people recognizing that they had just bet their lives on each other without knowing a single thing beyond the other's desperation. Everett felt it too. She saw it in the way his hand lingered 1 heartbeat too long before he pulled back. Then Levi stepped forward and took her other hand, squeezing once. Gentle, brief. You are not alone in this, he said. Whatever happens down there, we are beside you. Breyer moved from the door to stand with his brothers. 3 men shoulder to shoulder, looking at her with expressions that ranged from Everett's controlled intensity to Levi's warm reassurance to Breyer's blunt, unvarnished protectiveness. Then let us go convince Montana Territory. Everett said that we are madly in love. They descended the stairs together. The ballroom had transformed from celebration to battlefield. Mercer Voss commanded one corner surrounded by lawyers and furious investors who were calculating losses and assigning blame. His daughter Laurel had been escorted to another room, her sobs filtering through closed doors. Aldrich Crane was interrogating the house staff, and standing near the great stone fireplace, pale and rigid as a monument to maternal fury, was Cordelia Kincaid. Cordelia was 58 years old, and she was made from the same granite as the mountains that surrounded her ranch. She had buried a husband, raised 3 sons alone in country that killed weaker men every winter, managed an empire of land timber and cattle through drought, blizzard, grasshopper, plague, and financial ruin. She did not suffer fools. She did not accept surprises. And she was looking at Wren Bellamy with the exact expression of a woman who could disassemble a person using nothing but silence and a single raised eyebrow. Everett James Kincaid. Cordelia's voice was quiet in the way that dynamite is quiet in the moment before detonation. What have you done? What I should have done 6 months ago, Mother. Everett kept his voice respectful but immovable, the voice of a son who loved his mother deeply but had made a decision he would not unmake. I would like you to meet Wren, our wife. The word "our" hit the room like a second detonation. Whispers erupted into open murmuring, gasps. A woman near the punch bowl clutched her companion's arm for support. Cordelia's eyes swept Wren from boots to hairline, cataloging every detail with the efficiency of a woman who had been evaluating livestock, land, and people for 40 years. The threadbare coat, the muddy boots, the sewing kit still clutched like a talisman. Then her gaze moved to Everett's hand holding Wren's, to Levi's hand on her shoulder, to Briar standing behind them like a wall. All 3 of you, Cordelia said. Not a question, a detonation contained in 4 words. Yes, ma'am, Levi answered, because Everett's jaw had locked too tight for speech, and Briar had never been a man for unnecessary words. This was the first real test. The mother, the matriarch who could see through lies the way sunlight cuts through fog, who knew her sons better than they knew themselves and could read deception on their faces before they finished committing it. Wren met Cordelia's gaze directly, and she told the first of what would become many lies, this one constructed on the spot from nothing but instinct and the absolute certainty that the only way forward was through. 6 months, Mrs. Kincaid. We married quietly in Denver. Your sons wanted to honor the commitment to Miss Voss despite our situation, but I could not let Everett sacrifice his happiness or his brother's future for a political arrangement that would have destroyed everything your husband built. It was a masterwork of deception, romantic enough to be believable, scandalous enough to explain the secrecy. It invoked the dead father as justification, and it positioned Wren not as a gold digger or a schemer, but as a woman who loved these men enough to fight for them publicly at personal cost against forces far more powerful than herself. Cordelia stared at her for a long time. Something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance, something more careful than that. Recognition, perhaps, that this woman standing in a threadbare coat with mud on her boots and steel in her voice was more than she appeared to be. Mercer Voss shouldered through the crowd, Aldrich Crane at his elbow like a weapon on a leash. This is fraud, Kincaid. Obvious, transparent fraud. You expect anyone in this room to believe you have been secretly married to some vagrant seamstress in a mountain arrangement. This is a scheme, a plot, and I will see every one of you in prison for it. I expect you to believe what your eyes tell you, Voss. Everett's voice dropped to the register that made strong men reconsider their life choices. Our wife is standing right here. If you have questions about legality, our lawyer will provide documentation in the morning. What did they pay you, girl? Voss turned on Wren with the contempt of a man who assumed that everyone without exception had a price. How much to play pretend wife to 3 mountain men who cannot even keep their own house in order? The insult should have broken her. It was designed to. Voss had spent decades destroying people with words before he destroyed them with money, and he wielded contempt the way a surgeon wields a scalpel, with precision and without mercy. But Wren Bellamy had spent 3 years being looked down upon by every shopkeeper, every landlady, every well-dressed woman in Cedar Flats who crossed the street rather than walk too close to poverty. She had swallowed humiliation so many times it had become a flavor she barely noticed. And standing here in this room full of silk and champagne and cruelty, with Everett's hand steady around hers and Levi's warmth at her shoulder, and Briar's immovable presence at her back, she discovered something extraordinary. She was done swallowing. I do not appreciate your tone, Mr. Voss. Her voice was level, clear, pitched to carry exactly as far as she wanted it to, no further. And I certainly do not appreciate the assumption that I require payment to love the men I married. She let the words settle. Then she added the line that won the battle. Your daughter deserves better than a forced marriage to men whose hearts belong elsewhere. I should think you would thank me for sparing her that pain. The room shifted. It was subtle but unmistakable, the way a crowd recalibrates when it realizes that the person it was prepared to condemn might actually be the hero of the story. Suddenly, Wren was not the villain, not the schemer, not the poor girl who had wandered in from the snow. She was the woman protecting Laurel Voss from a loveless political arrangement. She was the defender of romance against the machinery of greed. Mercer Voss went silent, the most dangerous kind of silent. This is not over, Kincaid, he said finally, and the promise in his voice was not idle. Not by a very, very long distance. It is over for tonight. Everett straightened to his full height, and beside him Levi and Briar did the same. Three Kincaid men standing together, radiating a power that had nothing to do with money or politics, and everything to do with something older. Bone deep, the power of men who worked their own land, forged their own iron, broke their own horses, and answered to no one. Everyone out, the party is over. The room emptied slowly. Wren stood in the center of the ballroom, afterward, surrounded by abandoned champagne glasses and crushed flower petals, and the lingering scent of expensive perfume, wearing a dead woman's ring on her finger, flanked by three men she had known for less than 1 hour. When the last guest departed, the warmth disappeared from Everett like someone had thrown a switch. His voice returned to cold efficiency. You did well. I lied to your mother. You played your part. That is what we agreed. Levi was the one who showed her upstairs, not Everett, who disappeared into the study with a bottle of whiskey and a stack of legal documents. Not Briar, who went out into the snow to walk the property perimeter, checking every fence line and gate, an old habit from years of living in country where threats came on 4 legs and 2. This wing is yours, Levi said, leading her down the west hallway. 17 rooms. Pick whichever one you like. None of us will come here without an invitation. He paused at a door. This one faces east. Best sunrise on the ranch. On clear mornings, you can see 60 miles of valley from the window. You noticed I might want to see the sunrise. I noticed things. His voice softened in a way that made the hallway feel warmer despite the February drafts. It is what I do. Read what people need before they know they need it. He opened the door for her, then stepped back into the hallway, maintaining a distance that was both respectful and deliberate. Wren, I know this is terrifying. I know we are strangers asking you to trust us with your life. But for whatever it is worth, Everett has not drawn a full breath in 6 months. Tonight is the first time I have seen my brother look like himself since our father died. The unexpected kindness hit her harder than Prescott Kemp's grip, harder than Mercer Voss's contempt, harder than the miles of snow. Her eyes burned and she blinked fast against it because she had not cried since her mother's funeral, and she was not about to start now. Thank you, Levi. Do not thank me yet. Mother is going to make you regret every life choice that led to wearing that ring. But he smiled when he said it, a real smile, warm and slightly crooked, the kind of smile that made you believe things might actually be all right, even when every piece of evidence suggested otherwise. And Wren, lock your door tonight, not because of us. Briar would destroy anyone who tried anything, including his own brothers. But because you deserve to feel safe. You have not felt safe in a very long time, have you? The question opened something in her chest that she did not have the strength to close. She could not answer. Levi did not press. Good night, Wren. Welcome to the disaster. She locked the door, pulled off the ring, set it on the nightstand where 3 small diamonds caught the lamplight like 3 small questions she was not ready to answer. She was a liar now, a fraud, a woman pretending to be something she was not for money and shelter and the chance to survive another season. But as Wren Bellamy crawled into the softest bed she had ever touched, wearing the same gray dress her mother had sewn 3 years ago, mended so many times the patches told their own story of survival, she could not bring herself to feel guilty. Survival demanded uncomfortable compromises. Her mother had taught her that. And this compromise came with a roof that did not leak food in a pantry she had not yet seen, and 3 men who had stepped between her and cruelty, without hesitation when 200 other people had watched and done nothing. Tomorrow she would face Cordelia Kincaid's judgment, Mercer Voss's investigation, Aldrich Crane's legal machinery, a territory full of people ready to dissect her every move, and the most dangerous question of all, the one forming in the back of her mind like a storm building over the mountains, too large and too terrifying to examine in the dark of an unfamiliar room. She closed her eyes. Sleep came slowly, reluctantly, like a stray animal that did not trust the hand being offered. And somewhere in the east wing of the Kincaid Ranch, three brothers sat in Everett's study drinking whiskey by firelight, not speaking, each privately reckoning with the fact that the woman sleeping down the hall had already disrupted something none of them had anticipated. Something that had nothing to do with contracts or business arrangements or saving the ranch. Something far more dangerous. The morning arrived with a knock that shattered Wren's first peaceful sleep in months. "Mrs. Kincaid," the voice of Mrs. Pratt, the housekeeper, cut through the bedroom door like a blade. "Breakfast is served at 7. The family expects your presence downstairs in 20 minutes. Mrs. Kincaid." The name landed on Wren's chest like a millstone. She dressed in her only clean clothes, the gray dress, the mended boots, and descended the stairs into a dining room that could have contained her entire childhood home, with space left over for the barn. Everett sat at the head of an oak table that stretched 12 feet, reading a newspaper with the focused indifference of a man pretending last night had been entirely ordinary. Cordelia occupied the opposite end, her posture so rigid she appeared to have been carved from the same wood as the chair. Levi sat at Everett's right, eating ham and eggs with relaxed enthusiasm. Breyer sat at his left, cleaning a hunting knife with careful meditative focus, a habit that meant he was either perfectly calm or on the verge of violence, and only people who knew him well could tell the difference. All four looked up when she entered. "Good morning," she managed. Everett stood immediately. Automatic. The deep-bred courtesy of a man raised by a mother who tolerated no lapses in manners regardless of circumstances. Levi pulled out the chair beside him. Breyer set down his knife. "Coffee?" Everett asked, already pouring. "Sleep well," Levi added. "You are a liar if you say yes," Breyer said flatly. "This house sounds like dying cattle in a windstorm when the February drafts hit." "Breyer," Cordelia's voice carried a warning that could have stopped a charging bull. "What I am being honest. If she is going to live here, she should know what she has gotten herself into." "If she is going to live here," Cordelia set down her teacup with deliberate precision, "remains to be established." The temperature in the dining room dropped. Wren forced herself to meet the older woman's gaze across 12 feet of polished oak and the accumulated weight of 4 decades of Kincaid family authority. "You arrived at this house yesterday with nothing but a sewing kit and desperation," Cordelia said. Her voice was not cruel. It was surgical. "Today, you are wearing my mother-in-law's ring and sitting at my breakfast table. Forgive me if I require more than a pretty story and convenient timing before I accept you as my daughter-in-law." Every instinct in Wren's body screamed at her to apologize, to shrink, to become small and agreeable and unthreatening in the way that poor women learn to become when confronted by wealth and authority. But she thought of Prescott Kemp's hand on her arm, the laughter of the crowd, the 200 people who had watched her humiliation and done nothing. And she thought of 3 men who had not hesitated. "You are right," she said. Surprise flickered across Cordelia's face, barely visible. "But there. I arrived with nothing. I walked through a blizzard hoping for work that might pay enough to eat this week. I have no family, no connections, no fortune, no pedigree. There is no reason on this earth why anyone should believe your sons would choose me." She set down the coffee cup before her shaking hands could betray her. "But they did choose me. And whether you believe that choice was made 6 months ago in Denver or 6 hours ago in your ballroom does not change the fact that I am here at this table wearing this ring. So you can spend your energy proving I am unworthy. Or you can decide whether you would rather have sons who are free or sons trapped in a political marriage that would have handed everything your husband built to a man who never deserved it." Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room like water fills a glass, rising from the floor to the ceiling until there is no air left. Levi let out a low, impressed exhale. Breyer's hands stilled on the hunting knife, and then slowly the corner of his mouth turned upward. A real smile. The first Wren had seen from the youngest Kincaid, and it changed his entire face from threatening to something unexpectedly warm. Cordelia rose from her chair. We shall see how long that courage lasts when Mercer Voss's lawyers arrive. They will be here at 9. She left the dining room the way winter departs a landscape, slowly, without apology, leaving Frost in her wake. That, Levi said into the silence that followed, was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I have ever witnessed at this table, and I once watched Breyer challenge a grizzly to a staring contest. I won, Breyer said simply, and returned to his knife. The lawyers arrived early. Worse, they brought Sheriff Nolan Whitfield Everett's childhood friend, carrying a formal complaint, filed by Mercer Voss fraud, breach of contract, criminal conspiracy. If proven, the charges carried prison time for all 4 of them. Everett's lawyer had worked through the night. The documentation was immaculate. A marriage license dated August 15th from Denver County, hotel receipts, restaurant bills, 2 witness signatures from a minister and his wife who were conveniently traveling in California and would be unreachable for months. Papers that looked years old rather than hours old, prepared with meticulous attention to detail, that suggested Everett's lawyer was either very talented or very accustomed to creating things that needed to look older than they were. But Aldrich Crane was thorough. He probed every detail of the Denver story with the patience of a man dismantling a clock to find a single broken gear. When did you meet? Where precisely? Which shop were you working in? Describe the wedding ceremony, the minister's name, the flowers. What did you eat at dinner and then afterward? How long was the courtship? Who attended? What did you wear? Wren answered the rehearsed questions with the precision Everett had drilled into her over whiskey the previous night. And when the questions went beyond preparation, she improvised with a skill that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She described Everett's breakfast preferences from that morning's single observation. Named his horse from the black stallion she had glimpsed through her bedroom window. Guessed at details about Levi's horse training and Breyer's forge work that turned out to be so accurate that Levi actually raised an eyebrow, and Breyer stopped cleaning his knife to stare at her. She was reading them, she realized, the same way she read fabric. Understanding the structure and the pattern without conscious effort, the way a lifetime of careful observation and survival instinct had taught her to decode people the way she decoded cloth, finding the weave, the tension, the places where the material was strong and the places where it would tear. Then Crane asked the question designed to shatter everything. Mrs. Kincaid, this arrangement, 3 brothers and 1 wife, can you describe for the record how exactly that works on a daily basis? The room went deathly silent. Breyer's hand drifted toward his knife. Levi went very still. Everett's jaw tightened hard enough to crack stone. With all due respect, Mr. Crane. Wren's voice did not waver. She held the lawyer's gaze with steady, unflinching directness. How my marriage functions is between me and my husband's. If you are asking whether our union is legal, it is, documented and witnessed. If you are asking about our private life, that is not your concern. It is not relevant to any claim Mr. Voss believes he holds, and I suggest you redirect your questions to matters that actually pertain to the law. Your defensiveness is noted, Crane said, with the thin, satisfied smile of a snake that has found a crack in the floorboards. So is your indecency, Everett replied, his voice dropping to a temperature that could have frozen the river outside. Get out of my house, come back with a warrant, or do not come back at all. They left. The door closed behind them with a sound that felt heavier than wood and iron had any right to feel. And then Wren's legs gave out, and she sat down hard in the nearest chair, shaking in every limb, the adrenaline draining from her body like water from a cracked vessel. You were perfect, Everett said. I was terrified. That is what made it convincing. He poured whiskey, handed her a glass. Their fingers touched on the crystal, and the contact lasted 1 second too long for either of them to pretend it was nothing. 1 second of warmth, 1 second of connection between 2 people who had agreed in writing that connection was forbidden. Then Levi knelt beside her chair and gently took her left arm, pushing back the sleeve. His expression changed. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by something cold and quiet and dangerous. Bruises, purple and black in the black shape of a man's fingers. Prescott Kemp's fingers printed on her skin like a signature. He marked you, Levi said softly. Not to her, to the room, to his brothers, to the air itself. That senator's son left bruises on her. It is nothing, Wren said. It is not nothing. Breyer appeared with a cold cloth. He did not touch her, did not presume that right. He simply held the cloth out for her to take, and when she reached for it, his eyes met hers, and what she saw there was not hardness or barely contained violence. It was fury on her behalf. Pure, protective, scalding fury held under iron control because the person it was meant to protect was the one thing in this house he was actually afraid of frightening. Nobody marks you again, Breyer said. Nobody. 3 men, 3 different kinds of protection. Everett with his strategy and his legal shields. Levi with his warmth and his careful attention to damage both visible and invisible. Breyer with his forge-hardened hands and his willingness to stand between her and anything that might cause harm. Wren pressed the cold cloth to her arm and understood with quiet, devastating clarity that she was in far greater danger than Mercer Voss's lawyers would ever represent. She was living with 3 men who had saved her from humiliation, given her shelter, offered her a future, and were looking at her right now with varying degrees of concern that had absolutely nothing to do with contracts, business arrangements, or the $10,000 they had promised. And the contract they had all signed barely 12 hours ago specifically stated in Everett's precise handwriting, no emotional involvement. She was already failing. They were all already failing. And the worst part, the most dangerous part, the part that Wren could not stop thinking about as she sat in that warm study with a cold cloth on her bruised arm and 3 pairs of blue eyes watching her, was that she did not want to stop. Outside Montana territory, wind hammered the windows carrying fresh snow and the weight of everything that was coming. The investigation, the trial, the community that would judge them, the enemies that would try to destroy them, and the so relentless, terrifying gravity of 4 people falling towards something that no contract in the world could prevent. The ring sat on her finger, 3 diamonds, 3 brothers, 3 chances to survive or 3 chances to lose everything. Wren Bellamy finished her whiskey, set down the glass, and looked at the 3 Kincaid men who had just gambled their entire lives on a stranger they had known for less than a day. "So," she said, "what happens when they come back with that warrant?" Everett met her eyes, and for just a moment, just one unguarded fraction of a second, the mask he wore cracked, and something warmer, something terrified and hopeful and entirely human looked back at her. "Then we fight all," he said. And for the first time since her mother's death, Wren Bellamy believed that she might not have to fight alone. The dinner party was Cordelia Kincaid's idea, and it was designed the way a blacksmith designs a crucible to apply heat and pressure until whatever was inside either proved its strength or shattered into pieces. 15 guests, the most influential families in Montana territory. Ranchers and mine owners and territorial legislators and their wives, people who had known the Kincaid brothers since they were boys running barefoot through summer pastures, people who would notice every false note, every wrong detail, every crack in the fiction that Wren Bellamy was selling with nothing but nerve and a dead woman's ring on her finger. "This is not just dinner," Everett told her that afternoon, standing in the doorway of the sewing room while Mrs. Finch pinned emerald silk against Wren's frame. His shoulder rested against the door jamb, his expression carrying the focused intensity of a general reviewing the battlefield before the charge. "This is our trial. If these 15 people leave this house believing us, the territory follows. If they do not, Aldrich Crane gets his warrant and every one of us goes to prison." "You have a gift for encouragement," Wren said. Something flickered at the corner of Everett's mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe. The memory of what a smile used to feel like before 4 years of grief and 6 months of suffocation had taught him to lock his face down tight as a bank vault. "The green suits you," he said instead. Then he caught himself, and the expression closed again. "They will believe it. Looking like that, they will have no choice." It was not a compliment. It was a tactical assessment delivered in the tone of a man evaluating ammunition. But something in the way his eyes lingered 1 second too long on the emerald fabric against her skin told a different story entirely. And Mrs. Finch, who had been dressing the territory's women for 15 years and could read the distance between what men said and what they meant the way a surveyor reads elevation lines, noticed everything. Emerald green, the seamstress murmured after Everett had gone adjusting a pin at Wren's waist. Cordelia chose it herself. It will make your eyes impossible to ignore and remind every person at that table that you are not invisible anymore, that you never should have been. Why are you helping me? Wren asked. Mrs. Finch's hands went still on the fabric. She was quiet for a moment, her lips pressed together, the way people's lips press together when they are deciding how much truth to release. Because I have watched those three boys disappear over the past 6 months, she said finally. Everett stopped sleeping. You can see it in his face if you know where to look, the way the bones show through when a man is running on nothing but duty and coffee and the kind of fear that eats from the inside. Levi stopped smiling. Not the public smile, he can manufacture that on command, but the real one. The one that used to light up this house. And Briar started picking fights every Saturday night in town, looking for pain he could understand instead of the kind he could not. That engagement was killing them, Mrs. Kincaid. Slowly, quietly, the way winter kills. And whatever you are, whoever you are, you gave them a door to walk through. That counts for something in my book. Each brother prepared Wren for the evening's battle in his own way, and the differences between them told her more about who they were than any conversation could have. Everett drilled her on intelligence, names, alliances, political affiliations, grudges, vulnerabilities. He sat across from her at the study desk and delivered information with clipped military efficiency. Judge Harlan Croft is my godfather. Sharp as a new blade and twice as dangerous. He will ask questions that sound friendly and cut straight through to bone, so answer his kindness with precision and his warmth with honesty because he can smell a lie from 40 feet. Victoria Graves has despised me since I refused to court her younger sister 6 years ago. She will target you specifically, and she will be relentless. Morrison is a railroad investor with ties to Voss. Assume everything he says is designed to trip you. Do not drink more than 1 glass of wine. Levi taught her the personal details, the small, intimate facts that would make the fiction feel lived in, the kind of knowledge that only a real wife would carry. He sat with her in the kitchen, talking easily, naturally the way a man talks, when conversation is as essential to him as breathing. Everett takes his coffee black, toast with butter, never jam. He reads the newspaper front to back every morning and has done so since he was 14. He cannot abide the sound of whistling, though he has never explained why. Briar will not eat fish, got violently sick on trout at 12 years old, and has not forgiven the entire species. I play the fiddle on Saturday evenings, badly, with tremendous enthusiasm and no discernible talent. If anyone asks about music in this house, make sure you mention that because it is the kind of detail that makes a story real. He made her laugh, actually laugh. A genuine, unstoppable burst of sound that came from somewhere deep in her chest, somewhere that had been locked shut since the day her mother stopped breathing. The laughter surprised her so completely that she put her hand over her mouth as though the sound were something dangerous that had escaped. Levi went quiet watching her. His expression shifted to something warm and complicated, and slightly pained, the look of a man seeing something beautiful that he knows he is not supposed to touch. What? She asked. Nothing, just that sound, laughter. This house has not heard enough of it. Not for a Monheim. Briar's preparation was different from both his brothers. He did not talk, he did not drill, or coach, or share personal anecdotes. He appeared in the hallway outside her room an hour before the dinner guests were expected to arrive, and he held out a small knife in a leather sheath without preamble or explanation. Wren stared at it. What is this? Goes under your skirt. Straps to the ankle. You practice drawing it until you can have it in your hand in under 2 seconds. Briar, I cannot wear a knife to a dinner party. You can, and you will. His voice was granite, no room for discussion. When the women separate after dinner for parlor talk, I cannot follow you. Everett cannot follow you. Levi cannot follow you. If Victoria Graves or anyone else corners you in a room without us, you need something that belongs to you, something that does not depend on anyone else. The gift was so brutally practical, so completely devoid of romance or sentiment, and so deeply fundamentally protective in its intent, that Wren's throat closed around emotions she could not name and did not have time to examine. Thank you, she managed. Briar nodded once, turned to leave, stopped, spoke without turning back. The blade is sharp. I forged it myself this morning. If anyone puts their hands on you again, the way that senator's boy did, you use it. And then you tell me. And I will make sure they never use that hand again." He walked away. Wren stood in the hallway holding a knife forged at dawn by a man who did not know how to say what he felt, and so had hammered it into steel instead, and she understood that she was holding something far more dangerous than a weapon. She was holding proof that Briar Kincaid cared. The guests arrived at 7. By 7:15, the dining room had become a battlefield. Victoria Graves drew first blood before the soup course was finished. She was 36, elegant in the predatory way of women who had learned to use beauty as camouflage for cruelty, and she had positioned herself directly across from Wren with the strategic precision of a sharpshooter choosing a line of fire. "So, Wren," Victoria's voice was silk wrapped around a razor, "Levi tells us you met Everett in Denver. How wonderfully fortunate that you happened to be working in exactly the right dress shop at exactly the right moment." "Fortune had nothing to do with it," Wren replied, keeping her voice level while her pulse hammered against her ribs. "I needed work. He needed a gift for his mother's birthday. Sometimes the timing of things is just timing. And 6 weeks later, you were married. To all three brothers." Victoria's smile could have stripped varnish from wood. "How terribly adventurous of you." Beneath the table, out of sight of every guest, Levi's hand found Wren's. One brief squeeze. Warm fingers against cold ones. A signal, "I am here." Then he released her, and the contact was so quick that no one could have noticed. But Wren felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle in her chest like a coal from a fire she had not known she needed. "We wanted privacy for the ceremony," Everett said smoothly from the head of the table. Denver seemed appropriate. "How convenient," Morrison said from 4 seats down, that privacy also prevented witnesses. The interrogation continued through every course. Roast beef, potatoes, winter vegetables from the root cellar, each dish accompanied by questions disguised as curiosity and barbs wrapped in polite concern. "When did you realize it was all three brothers? How does the sleeping arrangement work? Are you not embarrassed? Where are your people from exactly?" Wren parried each question with the careful precision Everett had drilled into her and the personal warmth Levi had taught her to deploy. She talked about Everett's morning routines as though she had watched them for months. She described Briar's forge work with the specificity of a woman who had stood in the doorway 100 times, watching sparks fly. She mentioned Levi's fiddle playing with affectionate exasperation, and two guests actually smiled because the detail was so small, so domestic, so real, that it could not possibly have been fabricated. Then Victoria asked the question that was designed to end everything. "Your poor departed mother, where did you say she was buried?" The table went quiet, not comfortable quiet. The airless quiet of a room that has just realized it is witnessing something dangerous. Wren had not prepared this detail. None of them had. In the rush to construct a believable history, they had focused on the Denver wedding, the timeline, the how and when of meeting. No one had anticipated that Victoria Graves would go hunting for dead mothers. Boulder, Wren said, choosing a city far enough away to be difficult to verify, quickly close enough to Denver to be plausible. A small cemetery on the east side of town. Mountain View. "How lovely. I have cousins in Boulder." Victoria's smile widened by precisely the amount necessary to communicate that she intended to check. "What was your mother's maiden name?" "Miller, Catherine Miller." "Miller." Victoria tasted the name like wine she suspected was vinegar. "I shall have to ask my cousins to visit, pay their respects. Though it is strange, I could swear you mentioned during the first course that your mother was originally from Montana Territory. But now she is buried in Boulder, Colorado." Details do get muddled, do they not? Especially when one is trying to remember which version of a story one is telling. The accusation was not subtle. Victoria Graves was announcing to the entire table that she believed Wren was a liar, and she was doing it with the satisfaction of a cat that has cornered something smaller than itself. Wren's mind raced. Had she said Montana Territory? The evening had compressed into a blur of names and faces and careful lies, and she could not remember with certainty whether she had made that mistake or whether Victoria was fabricating the contradiction to create panic. Either way, the trap was closing, and every person at the table was watching. Before she could form a response, a sharp, crystalline sound shattered the tension. Briar's wineglass had broken in his hand, The room went dead silent. Fragments of crystal lay scattered across the white tablecloth, and blood seeped from Briar's palm in a thin red line, but his expression was the most unsettling part. He was perfectly calm, the genuine terrifying calm of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do next and is simply waiting for a reason to do it. "My apologies," Briar said. His voice was level, almost pleasant. His eyes locked onto Victoria Graves with a directness that made her smile falter for the first time all evening. "Clumsy of me. I must have been gripping too tight. I do that sometimes, when I hear something that bothers me." The message required no translation. Victoria Graves went pale beneath her powder. "Wren, would you help me with this?" Everett rose from his chair, recognizing instantly the tactical retreat his youngest brother had just created. "If you will excuse us." All four of them left the dining room together. In the hallway with the door closed and the sound of resumed conversation filtering through the wood, Briar examined his bleeding hand with mild, almost academic interest. "Worth it," he said. "You terrified her," Levi pointed out. "Good. Your hand." Wren reached for it without thinking. "It is nothing." But he let her look, her fingers on his palm, his blood warm against her skin. Their eyes met, and what she saw behind the iron exterior was not hardness or danger. It was something raw, vulnerable, a fierce, desperate gentleness that he had absolutely no idea what to do with, stored behind walls so thick that breaking a wine glass was the only way it could escape. "Thank you," she said quietly. Briar said nothing, but he did not pull his hand away, not for a long time. "We should go back," Wren said finally, "before they decide we ran." "Let them think what they want," Briar said. "No." Wren straightened, lifted her chin, set her shoulders the way her mother used to set hers, before walking into the bank to negotiate another extension on a loan they both knew they could never repay. "We go back. We do not give them the satisfaction of seeing us break." Everett and Levi exchanged a glance across the hallway. Something passed between them that did not require words equal parts, surprise and recognition, and the dawning, uncomfortable awareness that this woman they had hired to play a role was becoming something none of them had anticipated. They went back. The evening's true test came not from Victoria Graves, but from Judge Harlan Croft, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table for 2 hours, eating roast beef and drinking red wine and watching everything with the patient, devastating attention of a man who had spent 30 years on the bench reading witnesses the way other men read newspapers. "I am curious," the judge said during dessert, his voice carrying the weight that comes from decades of being the last word in any room he occupied. "Wren, does Everett talk about his father's vision for this ranch? Do you understand what it means? What it truly means to be a Kincaid in this valley?" The room held its breath. This was not an attack. It was something more dangerous. A genuine question from a man who had been Robert Kincaid's closest friend for 40 years, who had watched three boys grow into men who had the power to validate or destroy their story with a single word to the right people. Wren set down her fork. She looked at Judge Croft with the same directness she had given Cordelia that first morning, the directness that came not from confidence, but from having nothing left to lose. "Judge Croft, I do not pretend to understand the full history of this family or the weight of the Kincaid name. I was not raised in wealth or privilege. I was not raised around cattle or timber or mountain country. I was raised by a seamstress and a failed farmer in a house that was never warm enough. And I learned early that the world does not hand anything to women like me." She paused. The table was absolutely silent. "But I understand hard work. I understand loyalty. I understand what it means to fight for something when every reasonable voice tells you to quit. And I understand that sometimes the most important thing about a person is not where they came from, but whether they are willing to bleed for where they are going." She met his eyes without flinching. "These three men gave me a chance when no one else in this territory would have looked at me twice. That, as far as I can tell, is what being a Kincaid means. Seeing value in people that everyone else has decided to overlook." Judge Croft studied her for a long, unreadable moment. The fire crackled. Wind pressed against the windows. 15 guests held 15 breaths. Then the judge raised his glass. "To Wren Kincaid," he said, "may she prove to be as formidable as she sounds." After the last guest departed, Cordelia found Wren alone in the parlor, standing by the window, watching the darkness beyond the glass. Most of them think you are a fraud, Cordelia said from the doorway. I know. But Judge Croft does not. That matters more than all the rest combined. The older woman moved into the room, and for the first time her posture softened. A fraction. The way a fortress softens when the siege is lifted cautiously with the memory of arrows still sharp. When Everett introduced you tonight, his hand shook. I have not seen my son's hand shake since his father's funeral. When Victoria attacked you, Briar crushed Crystal in his bare fist rather than let her continue. And when you left the room, Levi watched the door with an expression I have not seen on his face since he was a child, waiting for his father to come home from a cattle drive. They're playing their parts, Wren said. Perhaps, or perhaps all four of you are playing parts that have started to feel more real than anyone planned. Cordelia's voice gentled in a way Wren had not heard before. My husband used to say the worst lies are the ones we tell ourselves. Remember that, Wren, when you are alone with my sons pretending you feel nothing. Remember that the most dangerous deception is the way you practice on your own heart. She left, and Wren stood in the empty parlor with those words settling into her bones like cold understanding, with perfect clarity that Cordelia Kincaid had just given her either a warning or a blessing, and that the difference between the two might not matter because the result was the same. The days that followed compressed Wren's world into something volatile and inescapable. She could not leave the ranch without one of the brothers accompanying her. She could not receive mail without it being checked for consistency. She could not speak to anyone in town without maintaining the performance. And within the walls of the Kincaid home, in the hours between public appearances, the contract's rules pressed against the reality of four people living in close quarters with increasing difficulty. Each brother carved his own space in her daily life. Distinct, unmistakable, impossible to resist. Everett was the strategist. Their late evening sessions in his study became ritual. Whiskey and documents and careful planning that increasingly gave way to real conversation. The kind that happens when two people who have agreed not to trust each other discover they have no one else to trust. He told her about his father's death, the cancer that ate through Robert Kincaid over 7 months, while his eldest son watched helplessly running the ranch by day and sitting vigil by night, learning that there is no strategy, no plan, no amount of willpower that can stop the people you love from leaving you. He told her about the debt, $20,000 accumulated across 3 years of drought that killed half the herd and dried the creek to a trickle. Banks that circled, creditors who called, the slow grinding humiliation of a proud man losing control of everything his family had built. And then one night, 3 weeks into the arrangement, with the fire burning low and the whiskey half gone and the hour past midnight, Everett told her the thing he had never told anyone. The night before the engagement party, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, stripped of every layer of control he normally wore like armor. I sat in this chair, in this room, with my father's revolver on the desk in front of me, and I seriously considered whether dying might be simpler than surrendering everything he built to a man who would gut this ranch for railroad profit. The words hit Wren like a physical blow. She stopped breathing. The fire crackled. Wind moaned against the windows. Everett, I am not telling you this for sympathy. His eyes were fixed on the fire, not on her. I am telling you because you deserve to understand what you walked into that night. You did not just interrupt a party. You interrupted a man who had run out of reasons to keep going. And then you stood in my ballroom in a threadbare coat with mud on your boots and looked Mercer Voss in the eye and told him his daughter deserved better. And for the first time in 6 months, I saw a different ending. She did not think. She reached across the desk and took his hand. He flinched at the contact, a full-body reaction that told her more about how long it had been since anyone had touched Everett Kincaid with gentleness than any words could have conveyed. But he did not pull away. His fingers closed around hers, tight, almost desperate. The grip of a man who has been drowning and has just felt something solid beneath his feet. They sat like that, connected by touch and silence, and the kind of understanding that forms between people who have both stood at the edge of something terrible and chosen against all reason to step back. The clock struck 1 in the morning. Neither of them moved. Levi's space in her life was different. Where Everett was darkness and strategy and the slow dismantling of walls built from grief, Levi was daylight and warmth, and the quiet revelation that the world contained gentleness if you knew where to look. He drew Wren into ranch life with effortless ease, teaching her to ride starting with the gentlest mare in the stable and progressing with patient, methodical instruction that treated every mistake as a step forward rather than a failure. Showing her the valley from ridgelines where Montana territory stretched in every direction, endless and wild and beautiful in ways that made her chest ache. Walking her through the horse barn, introducing each animal by name and temperament, explaining in his easy, unhurried voice the philosophy that guided everything he did. "You do not break them," he said one afternoon, standing beside a nervous mare who had been abused by a previous owner and flinched at every sudden movement. Breaking an animal teaches it that the world is dangerous and the only response is fear. You gentle them, you show up every day with patience. You let them come to you. You earn the trust instead of demanding it. And eventually, if you are consistent and honest and you never once betray the faith they have placed in you, they give you everything. Not because you forced them, because they chose to. He was talking about horses, but his eyes were on Wren. One afternoon, teaching her to gentle that nervous mare, his hands covered hers on the bridle to correct her grip. The contact was instructional, nothing more. Fingers over fingers adjusting pressure, demonstrating technique. But heat climbed Wren's neck and spread across her face, and Levi noticed immediately because Levi noticed everything. He stepped back. "Sorry. Do not be." "Wren." His voice carried a warning, not directed at her, at himself, at the thing building between them that neither of them had asked for and neither of them could stop. "The contract says no emotional involvement." "I know what the contract says." "Then you know why I need to be careful with you." His eyes held something that looked very much like pain. The pain of a man standing at the edge of something he wants desperately and forcing himself not to step forward. "Because if I am not careful, I will not be careful at all. And that would not be fair, not to you, not to my brothers, not to any of us." "What happens when the year is up?" she asked. "You leave. We pretend it never happened. That is the plan." A pause, a breath. That was the plan. And now I am not sure any of us knows what the plan is anymore. Briar's space was the most different of all. He did not have Everett's eloquence or Levi's warmth. His care expressed itself entirely through action, silent and relentless, and impossible to miss once you learn to recognize it. He built Wren a workbench in the sewing room without being asked. Not a rough plank across two sawhorses, but a proper workstation, the surface plane smooth as glass fitted with better lamplight than any room in the house, every joint tight, every edge sanded clean. He positioned it beneath the window that caught the most daylight, and he never mentioned building it, and when she thanked him, he said only, "You needed better light," as though constructing furniture overnight was something that simply happened like weather. He walked her to the barn each morning, checking the path for ice before she set foot on it. He placed himself between her and any visitor, any stranger, any delivery driver, or passing cowhand with the unconscious precision of a man whose instinct for protection operated below the level of thought. One evening, unable to sleep, Wren followed the sound of hammering to the forge. The door was open. Orange light spilled across the snow in a rectangle of warmth, and inside Briar worked iron with the focused, almost meditative intensity of a man having a conversation with the only material that understood him. The hammer rose and fell in steady rhythm. Sparks scattered like small, furious stars. She stood in the doorway and watched, and the watching felt like seeing something private, something sacred, a man alone with the only language he spoke fluently. "You can come in," Briar said without turning around. "I always know when you are there." "How?" He set the hammer down, turned to face her. Firelight caught the scar above his eyebrow and turned it gold. "You smell like lavender and thread. No one else in this house has that scent." The observation was so specific, so intimate, without crossing any line, so precisely calibrated to the boundary between noticing and reaching, that Wren felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Can I ask you something, Briar? You will ask whether I say yes or not. Why did you agree to this? Everett needed a way out of the engagement. I understand that. Levi follows Everett because that is what Levi does. He supports, he holds things together. But you do not follow anyone. You have never followed anyone in your life. So why did you say yes?" Briar was quiet for a long time. The forge crackled and popped. Iron cooled on the anvil, turning from bright orange to dull red to the color of dried blood. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of every layer of hardness he normally wore. Because my brother was dying, not fast, not the way our father died, where you can see it coming and count the days. Slow, the kind of dying where you watch someone you love disappear behind their own eyes a little more each day. Where the man who raised you and protected you starts turning into a stranger who sits in his study at midnight, staring at nothing, and you know in your gut that one of those nights he is not going to come out. He picked up the hammer, set it down again. I would have married a rattlesnake if it meant getting my brother back. He looked at Ren, directly, without armor. Turns out we got something better than a rattlesnake. That is the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me, Ren told him, and she meant it completely. Briar almost smiled. The expression was small and brief and immediately suppressed like a match struck in a dark room and then blown out before anyone could see by its light. But Ren saw. The morning Amos Pike arrived changed everything. Pike was Mercer Voss's hired investigator, a private detective from Denver, 41 years old with eyes the color of slate, and the professional demeanor of a man who had built his career on finding things that other people wanted hidden. He had been at the ranch for 4 hours, quietly questioning the household staff before anyone in the Kincaid family knew he was on the property. He cornered Ren in the kitchen after breakfast, his notebook open, his pencil sharp, his questions falling like controlled demolition charges, each one precisely placed to bring down a specific wall. The dress shop in Denver exists, Pike said, located exactly where you described on the corner of Larimer and 16th Street. Their employment records, however, show no Ren Bellamy working there last August. No woman by that name at all. The blood left Ren's face so fast she felt dizzy. She gripped the edge of the kitchen and improvised with the desperate, scrambling creativity of a woman watching her lie collapse in real time. She gave her mother's maiden name Miller, said she had worked under that name to avoid creditors pursuing her father's debts. Mentioned the shop owner recently deceased, whose records were likely incomplete. It held. Barely. The way a bridge holds when half the supports have been knocked out and the remaining ones are groaning under the weight. Pike studied her for a long moment, his pencil still, his slate eyes reading her the way Levi read horses and Everett read contracts, and Briar read the quality of iron and the color of its heat. Then he closed his notebook, thanked her politely, and departed with the quiet confidence of a man who already knew the bridge was going to fall and was simply deciding the most efficient way to push it. After he left, Everett gathered his brothers and Ren in the study and closed the door. He had specific information, Everett said. His voice was calm, but his knuckles were white around the whiskey glass. Someone told him to check employment records at that particular shop. Someone who knew Ren arrived here seeking seamstress work. That is not a detail you guess. That is a detail someone provides. The realization struck the room like a hammer on an anvil. Mrs. Pratt, Ren whispered. The housekeeper. She was at the servants' entrance the night I arrived. She heard me ask for work before anyone else in this house knew I existed. She has worked for this family for 12 years, Levi said, and the disbelief in his voice carried the weight of betrayal. Voss has resources to apply pressure in ways we cannot counter, Everett replied. Money, threats, leverage over people's families, their debts, their secrets. Mrs. Pratt has a son in Billings with gambling debts. That is exactly the kind of vulnerability Voss exploits. Briar said nothing. He stood, walked to the door, and left the room without a word. 20 minutes later, he returned. Found her in the kitchen, he said, his voice flat as hammered iron, burning letters in the stove. Voss has been paying her $50 a month since September. She has been reporting everything. Ren's arrival, the details of our story, which rooms we sleep in separately. Everything Crane would need to prove this marriage is fiction. The betrayal hit Cordelia hardest. The older woman had trusted Mrs. Pratt for over a decade, had confided in her, had treated her as something closer to family than staff. When Briar delivered the news, Cordelia's face went white, then hard as mountain stone, and the transformation was terrible to watch, because it was not anger. It was grief. The grief of discovering that loyalty, like everything else in this world, could be purchased by the highest bidder. Remove her from this property, Cordelia said. Tonight. And from this moment forward, no one enters or leaves this house without family knowledge. No one. It was the first time Cordelia included Wren in the word family without qualification, without condition, without the careful distance she had maintained since the night of the engagement party. And the word offered in the middle of betrayal and crisis meant more than $10,000. Everett's response to the revelation was to go on the offensive. Stop hiding, stop cowering behind forged documents and rehearsed stories. Go public. Let Voss's remaining watchers report back that the Kincaid family was conducting itself exactly as any ordinary married family would, with nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Church on Sunday, shopping in town, public appearances where three brothers and their wife moved through Cedar Flats with easy familiarity. The church nearly broke them. The congregation stared as all four entered, together, walking down the center aisle, in the silence that only falls in sacred spaces when something profane intrudes. Whispers rippled through the pews like wind through wheat. Victoria Graves sat 3 rows back, watching with focused patience. They sat, Wren between Everett and Levi. Breyer at the end of the pew positioned it where he could see every entrance, every exit, every face that turned toward them, with anything resembling hostility. The sermon began, but Wren could not focus. She felt the collective attention of the community pressing against her back like physical weight. Then Everett's hand found hers in the narrow space between them, hidden by the pew, hidden from every watching eye, not for show. He simply laced his fingers through hers and held on, and the grip was not calculated or strategic. It was the grip of a man who needed an anchor. On her other side, Levi's shoulder pressed against hers, steady, warm, present. And Breyer at the end of the pew shifted his weight so that his body blocked the view of anyone who might be watching, their hands providing cover for a moment of genuine connection with the same instinct that made him check the path for ice each morning. 3 men, 3 different languages of love, all of it silent, all of it breaking rules they had sworn in writing to follow. After the service, Victoria intercepted them outside the church doors, her smile in place like a freshly sharpened weapon. Wren, darling, I have been thinking about your mother's resting place in Boulder. Which cemetery did you say Mountain View was? I do plan to write to my cousins and ask them to visit. Everett's hand tightened on Wren's. Victoria, Everett said, his voice carrying the calm that preceded his most dangerous moments. If you wish to spend your time investigating the personal details of our family's private life, that is your prerogative. But I would suggest that a woman with your own history of complicated personal arrangements might want to be careful about which stones she chooses to turn over. Victoria's smile froze. Whatever history Everett was referencing, it hit its mark. She turned and walked away without another word, but the set of her shoulders promised that this retreat was tactical, not permanent. In the carriage heading home, Wren spoke the truth that all 4 of them already knew. She is going to investigate. She is going to find contradictions. She is going to prove I am lying. Then we get ahead of it, Everett said. You cannot forge a grave, Everett. I can forge anything if it keeps you safe. The raw intensity in his voice stopped the conversation dead. Wren stared at him. Levi went still on the opposite bench. Breyer, on horseback beside the carriage window, turned his head. Why, Bumpum? Wren asked. The contract says you will protect me legally, but this goes far beyond legal protection. You are risking everything, your reputation, your freedom, your family's legacy. For what? A business arrangement? Everett looked at her, and something in his expression cracked open. Not all the way, but enough. Because the moment I pulled you onto that ballroom floor and called you our wife, it stopped being business. The confession detonated in the small space of the carriage. Everett, Wren began, do not tell me it is just a contract. Do not remind me of the rules I wrote. His voice had gone rough, the polished control stripped away. I know what we agreed. I know what this was supposed to be. But somewhere between the lies and the performance, somewhere between watching you stand up to my mother and face down Voss's lawyers and tell Victoria Graves that my daughter deserves better with a spine made of iron, I started wishing the lies were real. And I do not know how to stop. The carriage rocked gently on the frozen road. Wind pressed against the windows. From the opposite bench, Levi spoke. His face was pale. His voice was quiet. He is not the only one. Outside, Breyer said nothing. But when Ren turned to look at him through the carriage window, his expression held everything his words never could. Fierce, desperate, tender in a way that looked almost painful on a face built for hardness. "This is impossible," Ren whispered. "The contract, the rules, all three of you, I cannot." "You cannot choose," Everett said. "That is not what I—" "You do not have to choose." Levi leaned forward. "That is not how this works. Not for us. We came into this together. Whatever this becomes, we stay in it together. All four of us or none." Ren opened her mouth to respond, to argue, to list the 100 reasons why what they were describing could not work, should not work, was the most reckless and irrational and beautiful thing she had ever heard. Then gunfire cracked through the winter air. The carriage lurched violently to the left. Horses screamed. The driver shouted. Everett threw his body over Ren as the vehicle tilted, slamming them both against the sidewall. The world became noise and impact in the sharp, bright pain of Ren's head striking wood. They hit the ground hard. The carriage rolled onto its side with a sound of splintering timber and shattering glass. Pain exploded through Ren's skull. Briar was off his horse and returning fire before the carriage stopped moving. 3 shots. Controlled. Precise. Aimed not to kill, but to suppress, driving the attackers back, while his brothers extracted themselves from the wreckage. 3 riders. 2 of them recognized from the church the previous week railroad surveyors who had been in the valley all month under the pretense of mapping a new spur line. The third was a stranger hired muscle, the kind of man whose profession was violence and whose loyalty extended exactly as far as the money that had purchased it. Levi pulled Ren from the overturned carriage, his hands shaking, checking for injuries with desperate, methodical focus. Blood ran from her temple in a thin, warm line. "She is hit," Levi called, and the crack in his voice said everything about the distance between the easy, smiling man the world saw and the terrified one underneath. "Head wound," Everett said, pressing his handkerchief to the cut, his hand steady through what had to be sheer force of will. "Not deep. She is going to be fine." The 3 riders had fled toward Voss's property. Briar rode back from his pursuit rifle, still smoking his expression, carrying the cold, absolute fury of a man who has just discovered the precise identity of the people he intends to destroy. "Voss's men," Briar said, "headed for his territory." "They are escalating," Everett had said, his hand still pressed against Ren's bleeding temple. "They are desperate." Ren corrected, her head throbbing, but her mind clearing. "Because the investigation is not working. Your lawyer's documents and are holding. Every public appearance strengthens our story. The dinner party earned us Judge Croft's support. They needed to scare us into a mistake, into running into breaking the performance." "Then they miscalculated," Briar said, and his voice carried the quiet finality of a coffin lid closing. "Because all they accomplished was proving they are willing to kill, and that changes everything." Back at the ranch, Cordelia cleaned Ren's wound without comment. Her hands were gentle, her movements precise, and the silence between them was not the hostile silence of the first morning, but something different, something closer to the silence between people who have passed through fire together and no longer need words to communicate what matters. "This is going to get worse before it ends," Cordelia said, wrapping a clean bandage around Ren's head. "I know." "Are you prepared for that?" Ren thought about the gunfire, the crash, the terror. She thought about 3 confessions hanging unfinished in the winter air. "No," she admitted, "but I am not running." "Why not? You could leave tonight, take the money and disappear." "Because leaving would destroy your sons." Ren met Cordelia's eyes in the lamplight. "And despite everything, the lies, the contract, the impossible situation, I cannot do that to them. I will not." Cordelia was quiet for a long time. Her hands finished the bandage, rested in her lap. "You love them," Cordelia said, not a question. Ren wanted to deny it, wanted to cite the contract, the rules, the mathematical impossibility of what she was feeling. 3 men, 1 heart. An equation that should not balance and yet somehow did. "It does not matter what I feel," she said instead. "What matters is stopping Mercer Voss before someone dies. It matters to my sons. And whether you are ready to admit it or not, it matters to you too." She left, and Ren sat alone in the kitchen with the truth settling into her bones. She loved them, all 3. Not the same way. Each brother had claimed a different chamber of her heart without asking permission and without giving warning. Everett had her mind, her respect, her aching desire to break through walls that had been standing since the day his father died. Levi had her trust, her laughter, the sense of safety that she had not felt since childhood. Briar had her gratitude, her fierce recognition of tenderness hidden behind iron, the understanding that the strongest things in this world are the ones that have been through the most fire. The contract said no emotional involvement. The contract was already ash. That evening, the four of them gathered evidence. Land deeds and sales records, in correspondence between Voss's railroad company and territorial officials, pulled from the safe in Everett's study where he had been quietly accumulating proof for months. Spread across the kitchen table, the documents told a story far larger than a broken engagement. 17 ranches in the Cedar Flats Valley, all purchased below market value in the past 6 months, all from families who had experienced convenient misfortunes beforehand. Barn fires, poisoned wells, fences cut in the night allowing cattle to scatter across 100 miles of open range. Systematic, patient, methodical destruction designed to crush resistance and force desperate sales to a buyer who was always ready with cash and a contract. He has been planning this for over a year, Everett said, his finger tracing the pattern on the map. The engagement to Laurel was the final piece. Control of Kincaid water rights would complete the railroad corridor through the valley. Every dollar of cattle shipping, timber transport, and mineral freight would flow through his hands. This could bring him down, Wren said. It will. It has to. Everett looked at her and his eyes tracked the bandage on her temple with an expression that made her chest constrict. But we need more. We need to catch them in the act. We need a judge to see it with his own eyes. The storm was coming. Not the kind made of snow and wind, though that was coming too. The storm that was coming was made of secrets and betrayal and the fury of powerful men who discover their power has limits. It was made of forged documents and real feelings and three brothers who had spent their lives protecting everything except their own hearts. And it was made of one woman, one formerly invisible woman with mud on her boots and a dead mother's sewing kit, and a spine forged from blizzard and poverty, who had walked into a lie and found something she was not willing to surrender. Not the money, not the ranch, not the ring with 3 diamonds that sat on her finger like 3 small promises, becoming more real with every passing hour. Something bigger. Something that could not be measured in acres or dollars or the terms of a contract written in desperate ink. Something that felt against all evidence and all reason and all the careful rules they had written to prevent exactly this, like home. The wind howled outside the Kincaid Ranch, carrying the scent of deeper cold and the weight of everything still to come. And Wren Bellamy sat at the kitchen table with 3 men who were looking at her with 3 different versions of the same impossible, terrifying, undeniable truth, and she did not look away. Not anymore. 3 days after the ambush, winter came for them with everything it had. The blizzard arrived without the courtesy of warning, not the slow, predictable storms that Montanans track by barometric pressure and the behavior of livestock, the kind that gave you a day to prepare to stock the root cellar, to bring the horses in, and settle by the fire with grim, practiced patience. This was different. This was the storm that old-timers called the white blind, the kind that erased the boundary between earth and sky until the world itself disappeared, the kind that killed men who stepped off their own porches and were found frozen 20 feet from their front doors because they could not see their hands in front of their faces, let alone the house they had lived in for 30 years. Everett read the signs at midday. The barometric pressure dropped like a stone falling down a well. The wind shifted from northwest to due north, and the quality of the cold changed, sharpening from the dull, manageable ache of ordinary February into something that felt like being cut with glass. But it was the cattle that told the real story. 200 head began pressing together in tight, anxious clusters across the north pasture, the ancient survival instinct of herd animals who sensed something coming that their owners had not yet named. He sent Roland Pickett to escort Cordelia and the remaining household staff to town before the roads became impassable. His mother argued. Cordelia Kincaid did not leave her home for weather or for men or for anything short of the direct intervention of the Almighty, and she made this position known in language that would have impressed a cavalry sergeant. Everett argued back. The argument lasted 4 minutes, which was 3 minutes longer than most people lasted against either of them, and ended when Everett said the one thing guaranteed to make his mother cooperate. If something happens to us, someone needs to be alive to fight Voss in court. That someone is you. Cordelia left. The silence after her departure was the silence of a house that has lost its center of gravity and is waiting to see which direction it will fall. That left 4 people on the Kincaid Ranch. Everett, Levi, Breyer, Wren, and 200 head of cattle that needed to be driven from the north pasture into the sheltered canyon corrals before the storm made the trail impassable, a job that required a minimum of 4 riders working in coordinated pairs across a mile and a half of open ground, while the temperature dropped toward a number that could kill exposed flesh in minutes. Wren was not a cowhand. She had never driven cattle. She had never worked in conditions where the air itself felt like an enemy, and the margin between survival and disaster was measured in the thickness of a glove or the tightness of a scarf around your face. But she could follow instructions. She could ride the gentle mare Levi had taught her on. She could keep her mouth shut and her hands steady and do exactly what she was told without complaint, and in a crisis, those qualities were worth more than expertise. They worked through the afternoon, 4 people against the wind, driving panicked cattle through deepening snow, while the sky turned the color of lead and the temperature fell and kept falling. Everett directed from horseback with hand signals when the wind stole his voice. Levi rode the flanks, turning strays with patient, relentless efficiency. Breyer took the rear, the most dangerous position where the slowest and most frightened animals bunched, balked, and threatened to scatter, and he held them together through sheer physical presence, his horse cutting back and forth, while Breyer sat the saddle like a man who had been born there. Wren rode beside Levi, doing what he told her, when he told her exactly the way he told her. She did not complain when the cold bit through her gloves and turned her fingers to wood. She did not falter when her horse stumbled in a drift and she nearly went over the saddle. She did not stop when the exhaustion hit so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She worked, the way her mother had taught her, the way poverty had trained her, the way the long walk through the blizzard that had brought her to this ranch had proved she could. By nightfall, the cattle were penned. The trail to the main house had vanished under 3 feet of new snow, the drifts piling higher by the minute, pushed by winds that screamed across the valley at 60 miles an hour. The 4 of them stood in the lee of the canyon corral horses, trembling, breath freezing to ice crystals before it traveled 6 inches from their mouths. And Everett made the calculation that every rancher in mountain country learns to make eventually, which risk is greater: pushing through the storm to reach the house or sheltering in place until the storm decides you have suffered enough. "The line cabin," he said, "quarter-mile south. We can make it if we stay on the tree line." The line cabin was a single-room structure built from pine logs designed to shelter cowboys during roundup season. 1 room, 1 stone fireplace. Enough canned provisions for 3 days if you rationed carefully. It was not comfortable. It was not spacious. It was 4 walls and a roof and a door that locked against the wind, and on a night when the temperature outside was dropping past 30 below, it was the difference between living and dying. They reached it in 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours, dismounting in the small, lean-to stable that sheltered 2 of the 4 horses while the other 2 pressed against the south wall, heads down, tails to the wind. Everett got the fire started with the efficiency of a man who had been building fires in emergency conditions since he was old enough to strike a match. Breyer hauled wood from the covered stack beside the cabin, enough for 3 days, calculating consumption against storm duration, with the precision of a blacksmith measuring fuel for a forge. Levi inventoried provisions: salt pork, hardtack dried beans, coffee, a jar of preserved peaches that someone had left there the previous autumn. 1 room, 4 people, a fire that would need feeding every 2 hours through the night, and a storm outside that was trying with patient impersonal malevolence to kill everything that breathed. The first night they talked about practicalities: fire rotation, food rationing, a schedule for checking the horses every 6 hours, which required opening the door against wind that hit like a freight train, and navigating 20 feet of blinding white to the lean-to and back, a journey so short and so dangerous that they agreed no one would make it alone. Breyer and Everett took the first horse check. They returned 12 minutes later, covered in snow so thick they looked like men carved from ice, and Breyer's eyebrows had frozen solid, which Levi pointed out with the kind of cheerful calm that only a man who processed terror through humor could maintain. "You look like Father Christmas," Levi said. "Shut up," Breyer said, but without heat, and the exchange felt like something essential, a moment of normalcy in the middle of catastrophe that reminded all four of them that they were still alive and still human and still capable of finding each other funny. Wren watched the three brothers that first night and saw something the dinner parties, in church services, and public performances had never shown her. She saw the way they worked together without speaking, each brother occupying his role with the unconscious precision of men who had been operating as a unit since childhood. Everett decided, Levi implemented. Breyer secured, no arguments, no discussions, no wasted motion. A machine built from brotherhood and hardship and the absolute trust that comes from knowing that the person beside you will die before they let you down. This was not performance. This was survival, raw and real and stripped of every pretense. And watching it, Wren understood something about mountain marriage that no amount of town gossip or church condemnation could have taught her. It was not scandal. It was not shame. It was the answer to a question that the mountains had been asking since the first men tried to live in them. How do you survive in a place that is trying to kill you? You survive by refusing to face it alone. You survive by building something together that is stronger than any one person, any one pair of hands, any one heart, beating against the cold. The second night, with the storm still raging and the fire burning low, and the four of them sitting close enough to share warmth because the cabin had only one source of heat, and the temperature outside had dropped to a number that Breyer said was too low to be useful information, Everett told his brothers the truth about their father. He knew. Everett's voice was quiet. The fire popped and hissed. Wind screamed against the logs. About the hidden clauses in Voss's contract. Father knew before he signed. The silence that followed was worse than the storm. Levi stopped breathing. His face, usually so warm and open and ready with a smile, went completely blank. Empty. The expression of a man whose understanding of the world has just been disassembled and who has not yet begun to rebuild it. Breyer stopped whittling the piece of kindling he had been shaping. The knife in his hand went still. His entire body went still, the way iron goes still when it cools past the point of malleability and becomes something rigid and permanent. Everett told them everything. The cancer that was eating through Robert Kincaid when Voss arrived with his proposal. 3 months to live, maybe less. $20,000 in bank debt from 3 consecutive drought years debt that would trigger foreclosure by spring. Voss's offer signed the marriage contract, including the hidden clauses, and the debt disappears. Refuse and the bank takes the ranch before the snow melts. He was dying, Everett said. Dying and terrified that his sons would lose everything he spent his life building. Voss came to him at his lowest moment with a choice that was not really a choice at all. Sign away freedom for land or lose the land and the freedom both. He sold us, Breyer said. His voice was flat. The knife lay motionless in his hand. He saved us. Everett's correction was gentle but firm. Without Voss's money, the bank would have foreclosed last spring. We would have nothing. No ranch, no land, no home. Father chose to keep the ground under our feet at the cost of my freedom, and he did it because he believed that as long as we had the land, we could find a way to fight back. Then why did you not tell us? Levi's voice broke on the question, and the sound of it, the crack in that usually steady warmth, was worse than anything the storm could produce. Because telling you would not have changed anything. The debt was real. The contract was binding. Father was dead. Everett paused. The fire crackled. I carried it alone because that is what the eldest does. That is what Father taught me. You protect your brothers. You carry the weight. You keep the walls standing even if it crushes you, because that is what Kincaid men do. No, Breyer's voice shook. It was the first time Wren had ever heard that voice shake, and the sound of it was almost unbearable, like watching iron bend under forces it was never meant to withstand. That is what family does. Together. And you took that from us. You carried it alone, and you let it nearly destroy you, and you never once gave us the chance to share the weight. The confrontation hung in the cabin like smoke. 2 younger brothers seeing for the first time the full scope of what their elder brother had borne alone. An elder brother realizing perhaps for the first time that his solitary strength had been its own form of betrayal. Wren sat against the wall, silent. This was not her moment. This belonged to the 3 of them, to the ghost of their father, to the complicated, painful, imperfect love that bound them together even when it tore them apart. But then Everett looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the question he could not ask: are you going to run? Now that you know where we come from, now that you see the broken foundation this family is built on, are you going to wish you had never walked through that servant's entrance? Your father made the wrong choice, Wren said quietly. But he made it for love. He was dying and he was desperate, and he chose the only option that kept his sons on their land. And the cost of that choice was something he knew he would not live long enough to pay. She looked at all three of them. You are not your father. You are choosing differently. You are fighting back instead of surrendering, and you are not doing it alone anymore. Briar stared at her for a long time. Then he nodded, just once. Sharp and final, and carrying the weight of a decision made at the deepest level a man can reach. The anger in his eyes did not disappear, but it shifted direction, pointing away from Everett and toward the man who had exploited a dying father's desperation, toward Mercer Voss. The third morning the storm broke. They dug out of the cabin into a world transformed. 3 feet of new snow covered every surface, and the sunlight reflecting off it was so bright it hurt to look at. The air was clean and sharp, and so cold it burned the lungs, and the silence after 3 days of screaming wind was almost disorienting, like going deaf in reverse. They dug a path back to the main house. It took 4 hours of brutal labor, the four of them working in rotation, two shoveling, while two rested and then switching a rhythm as natural and practiced as if they had been doing it their entire lives. When they finally reached the front porch, exhausted, frostbitten, covered in snow, Wren stumbled on the last step and Everett caught her arm to steady her, and Levi wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and Briar walked behind them all the way inside, checking one final time that nothing had been left behind. Something had changed in the cabin. None of them named it. None of them needed to. 3 days of survival in a single room, sharing warmth and food and fire duty, had done what months of performance could not. The contract was paper. The rules were ink. What had formed between them was something else entirely, forged under pressure and heat, the way Briar forged iron shaped by necessity into something that would hold. Word from town reached them that afternoon, carried by Roland Pickett on a horse half dead from the ride. 7 families in the valley had received foreclosure notices from First Mountain Bank in the same week. All of them were properties Voss had been pressuring to sell. And First Mountain Bank, which had operated independently for 20 years, had been quietly acquired by Voss's railroad company 2 months prior. He is not just targeting us anymore, Everett said, spreading the valley map across the kitchen table, marking properties with red ink. He is buying the entire valley, every ranch, every homestead, every acre. If he controls the water and enough of the land corridor, the railroad route through Montana goes directly through Cedar Flats, and every dollar of freight revenue for the next 50 years flows through his pocket. How many families, Wren asked? 17 already sold under Pruner. 7 more being foreclosed right now. If he succeeds, Cedar Flats dies. Every family that is left gets squeezed out. Nothing remains but railroad track and empty ground. We need Voss's daughter, Wren said, and the name Laurel dropped into the room like a key sliding into a lock. They had not discussed Laurel Voss since the night of the engagement party, but Wren had been thinking about her. Thinking about the woman who had screamed when Everett broke the engagement, but who had not, Wren now realized, actually cried, who had been escorted from the room with what looked like hysteria, but might have been something else entirely. Relief, perhaps, or the complicated grief of a woman who had just been publicly freed from a prison she had not chosen to enter. Everett met Laurel at Mrs. Finch's shop in Cedar Flats, the meeting disguised as a dress fitting for Wren. Laurel arrived alone without escort, which in 1883 was itself a statement of independence that would have scandalized half the territory. She was thinner than Wren remembered from the engagement party, with dark circles under her eyes and the stillness of a woman who has been making very large decisions in very small rooms. I know what my father is doing, Laurel said without preamble. Her voice was steady, but her hands folded in her lap trembled slightly at the knuckles. I have known for longer than you might imagine, longer than the engagement, longer than the contract. How, Everett asked. My father keeps documents in a safe in his home office. I have known the combination since I was 14. He never changed it because it never occurred to him that his daughter might be curious, or intelligent, or paying attention. A thin, bitter smile. He has always had a very specific understanding of what women are capable of. It is one of his many misjudgments. What Laurel described changed everything. Inside that safe contracts documenting every forced land purchase. Letters between Voss and territorial officials discussing acquisition strategy. Financial records connecting Voss's railroad company to the purchase of First Mountain Bank. Correspondence with Burke, his enforcer, authorizing the intimidation campaign against holdout families. And one letter in particular, written in Voss's own hand, directing Burke to resolve the Farrow situation by the end of the month if Emmett Farrow refused to sell. The end of the month was 4 days away. Why? Wren asked. Why help us? Why betray your own father? Laurel looked at her for a long time. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the weight of years of silence. Because you have something I never had. You had a choice. You chose to stay with these men. I was sold to them, wrapped in silk, and presented as a gift that was really a trap, and no one not once asked me whether I wanted to be given. She paused. And because my father has destroyed enough families, 17 and counting, I do not want to add to that number. I am tired of being the daughter of the man who ruins lives. The plan came together with the precision of a military operation and the desperation of a last stand. Everett's strategy was clear. Let Voss make his move against the Farrow Ranch, catch his men in the act, and use the physical evidence of arson, combined with the documentary evidence from the safe, to build a criminal case that would bring down the entire operation. But this required allowing the Farrow property to be attacked, and that was something Wren refused to accept without conditions. We cannot use Emmett Farrow as bait without telling him, she said flatly in the tone of voice that Everett had learned meant she would not be moved by argument, persuasion, or cold logic. This is his land, his family, his life. He gets to decide. If Farrow knows, he will fight, Levi said. He is 63 years old and stubborn as bedrock. He will stand on his porch with a rifle and dare them to come. Then we tell him the truth, all of it. We explain that the only way to save his land and every other family's land is to sacrifice the barn. Let them burn the outbuilding. Save the house by emptying it first. Catch them in the act with a judge as witness. And if he refuses, Breyer asked, then we respect his decision. It is his ground. Everett studied her across the kitchen table. The map between them was covered in red marks, each one a family's destroyed livelihood. And looking at Wren, at this woman who had walked into his life through a servant's entrance 5 weeks ago with nothing but a sewing kit, Everett saw something that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He saw his equal, not his employee, not his prop, not the woman he had hired to play a role, his partner, the person who should be standing beside him when the decisions that mattered most had to be made, not because she agreed with him, but because she had the spine to disagree when he was wrong. We go see Farrow, Everett said. Emmett Farrow was 63 years old, lean as a fence rail from decades of working land that gave back less than it took, with hands the size of shovels and a jaw set at an angle that suggested God had designed it specifically for stubbornness. He sat at his kitchen table while 4 people laid out the situation with complete honesty. He listened without interrupting. When they finished, the silence lasted a full minute. You want me to let them burn my barn, he said finally. The barn can be rebuilt, Everett said. If we catch them in the act with Judge Croft as witness, Voss faces criminal charges. Every foreclosure gets reversed. Every family that sold under duress has grounds to sue for recovery. And my family, Sarah and the children, stay at our ranch that night, safe, warm, protected. Emmett looked at Wren, not at Everett, not at the brothers, at her. What do you think, Mrs. Kincaid? The question surprised everyone in the room. But Wren answered without hesitation. I think barns can be rebuilt and valleys cannot. I think your grandchildren deserve to grow up on this land, and that will not happen if Voss succeeds. And I think you already know all of this, Mr. Farrow, because you are the kind of man who has been doing the hard math of survival his entire life. Emmett was quiet for another long moment. Then he nodded. I am too old to fight with my fist, he said. But if we are fighting with the law, then I am in. The night of the operation, the valley held its breath. Everett positioned his people with the precision of a chess player executing an endgame. Emmett Farrow and his family departed the homestead in late afternoon, driving their wagon toward the Kincaid Ranch with the unhurried pace of a family visiting relatives, visible to anyone watching conspicuously ordinary. Livestock had been moved to Kincaid pasture the previous day. The farmhouse was shuttered and dark. Everett Breyer and Roland Pickett took position in the tree line north of the property, sheltered by pines with clear sight lines to the barn, the house, and the road from Voss's territory to the west. Levi held the southern approach with two trusted ranch hands, who are covering the only other route in. Wren positioned herself with Everett carrying the signal lantern that would alert Judge Croft waiting 1 mile east with his son David, the deputy sheriff, and 4 armed citizens who had volunteered when they learned what Voss had done to their neighbors. "You do not need to be here," Everett said in the darkness, his voice carrying something that was not quite an order and not quite a plea. "The answer has not changed," Wren replied. Oh. He did not argue. In the darkness, his hand found hers. Not for any audience. There was no audience. He held her hand because he needed to know she was there the way a man needs to feel the ground beneath his feet to know he is still standing. They waited. Near midnight, 6 riders appeared from the west. Burke led them, recognizable even in darkness by his size and the way he sat a horse heavy and graceless. Behind him, 5 men carrying torches and kerosene cans, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before at other ranches to other families, with the casual cruelty of people performing a job they had stopped thinking of as criminal. Burke checked the farmhouse first, dark, empty. He circled the property, once scanning for signs of ambush, and found nothing because Everett had positioned his people with the patience and precision of a man who understood that the difference between success and failure was measured in the distance between a boot print and a shadow. Satisfied, Burke signaled. 2 men began pouring kerosene on the barn walls. A third prepared a torch. The smell of fuel cut through the cold night air, sharp and chemical, and carrying the promise of destruction. Wren lit the signal lantern. 3 flashes, the agreed code. Then Breyer fired the first shot into the air. The sound split the night like an axe through timber. Horses screamed, men cursed. Burke wheeled his mount toward the tree line, reaching for the pistol on his hip. "Do not move." Everett's voice rang across the clearing with the authority of a man who had spent his entire adult life commanding men and land and weather and everything else the mountain threw at him. "You are surrounded. Drop your weapons." Chaos erupted. 2 of Burke's men tried to ride south directly into Levi's position. He turned them back with 2 shots placed in the dirt ahead of their horses, close enough to spray gravel, far enough to make the point without drawing blood. 3 others threw their torches, one of which caught the barn's east wall, the dry timber igniting with a sound like tearing cloth flames, climbing fast and bright against the dark sky. Roland Pickett was already moving with water buckets, limiting the damage, keeping the fire contained to the one wall. Burke made his decision. He went for his gun. 3 shots fired simultaneously. Everett's round took Burke's hat off his head, the felt crown spinning into the darkness. Breyer's shot struck the ground 6 inches from his horse's front hooves, sending the animal into a rearing, screaming panic. And Levi, who everyone always forgot was the best marksman in the family because he was so quiet about his abilities, put a bullet through the rope, tying Burke's canteen to his saddle, severing it cleanly, the canteen spinning away into the night with a metallic clatter. Not killing, not even wounding, simply demonstrating with absolute terrifying precision that if the next shots were aimed differently, the outcome would be very different. "Next round goes lower," Everett said, his voice carrying the calm of a man who meant every syllable. "Your choice." Burke's hired men calculated the odds. 6 of them against 3 Kincaid brothers, a deputy sheriff, 4 armed citizens, and a woman holding a signal lantern with the expression of someone who would not lose a minute's sleep over whatever happened next. The math was unfavorable. Weapons hit the dirt. Judge Harlan Croft arrived 7 minutes later, riding hard despite his 64 years, his son David beside him with handcuffs, and the grim professional expression of a lawman who took his work personally. The judge dismounted into a scene of controlled chaos. 6 disarmed men, a partially burned barn, kerosene cans scattered across the ground like evidence arranged by a thorough prosecutor, and the smell of smoke and justice mingling in the frozen air. "This is sufficient for arrest warrants," Croft said after examining the scene. "Arson, attempted destruction of property, criminal conspiracy. But to bring Voss himself into the charges, I need the documents. The safe." "Laurel Voss will testify," Everett said, "and Aldrich Crane has copies of everything in that safe. Insurance, he called it. A lawyer's hedge against being abandoned by his client." Croft looked at him sharply. "You are certain?" "Wren is certain." Everett glanced at her, and she has not been wrong yet. Voss ran. He learned of the arrest through channels that money maintains even in crisis. And he boarded the 3 o'clock morning train to Denver with the contents of his safe packed into crates, intending to destroy the evidence and rebuild from a distance the way men of his brand of wealth always believed they could escape consequences through geography. He was wrong. Aldrich Crane, confronted with the prospect of criminal prosecution as an accessory to everything his client had done, chose survival over loyalty. Within 3 hours of Voss's departure, Crane was sitting in Judge Croft's dining room with a complete set of duplicate documents, copies he had maintained for exactly this contingency, providing detailed testimony about 17 forced land acquisitions, systematic intimidation campaigns, the secret purchase of First Mountain Bank, and the letter authorizing the attack on the Faro Ranch. Burke broke next, confirming everything Crane provided and adding details of his own names, dates, methods, the precise amounts Voss had paid for each act of arson and destruction. A ledger of criminality so thorough and so damning that Judge Croft said quietly and without drama that it was the most comprehensive evidence of conspiracy he had seen in 30 years on the bench. Voss was arrested at the Denver train station 2 days later, attempting to transfer funds to an account in San Francisco. The safe was empty. He had burned everything, but it no longer mattered. Crane's copies Burke's testimony, Laurel's willingness to corroborate, and the physical evidence from the Faro Ranch combined into a case that Voss's new lawyers examined for 20 minutes before advising their client that his options had narrowed to a single unpleasant point. Mercer Voss faced 18 criminal charges. The railroad company was placed under investigation. The foreclosures were frozen. 17 families received notice that their forced sales would be reviewed. And the man who had spent 30 years building an empire of intimidation and greed discovered in a Denver jail cell with iron bars that Briar Kincaid could have forged in his sleep, that power has limits, that wealth cannot purchase immunity from justice, and that the woman he had dismissed as a vagrant in a ballroom 5 weeks ago had been the architect of his destruction. 1 week after the preliminary hearings concluded, Cordelia Kincaid called a family meeting. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they had spread maps and planned operations and shared meals, and argued about strategy, and in the quiet hours after midnight talked about things that mattered more than strategy. Everett at the head, Levi to his right, Briar to his left, Wren beside Levi, Cordelia at the opposite end, straight-backed, clear-eyed, the matriarch who had held this family together through everything the mountain Quattro had hit. The contract specifies 1 year, Cordelia said, looking at her eldest son. It has been 5 weeks. Voss is in custody. The engagement contract your father signed is void. There is no longer any legal reason to maintain this arrangement. Silence filled the kitchen. Therefore, I am asking as your mother and as the woman who has run this household for longer than any of you have been alive, does she stay or does she go? The question was not directed at Wren. It was directed at her sons. Everett spoke first. He did not look at his mother. He looked at Wren. Before I answer that, there is something I need to say. He stood and retrieved a document from the kitchen drawer. This is the deed to the Kincaid Ranch. 4,000 acres. 3 generations of work. He placed it on the table between them. When father signed in Voss's contract, there was a secondary clause. If the marriage was dissolved for any reason, Voss retained the right to reclaim the debt forgiveness. $20,000 plus interest. We do not have that money. If Voss's company activates that clause, the bank forecloses and everything father built disappears. The room went cold. Voss is in jail, Everett continued, but his railroad company still exists. His lawyers will activate that clause the moment they can prove our marriage is a fraud, which means our choices are these: we make the marriage real permanently, irrevocably, and eliminate any grounds for challenge. Or I surrender the deed. Transfer the ranch to the Valley families, divide 4,000 acres among the 17 homesteads that Voss destroyed. If the Kincaid name is no longer attached to the property, there is nothing to foreclose. Voss loses. The Valley survives. And we lose everything, Briar said. We lose land. Everett's voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man who has made peace with a sacrifice he hopes will not be necessary but is prepared to make. We do not lose each other. Cordelia placed both hands flat on the table. You are proposing to give away 4,000 acres that your father spent his life building. Father would have wanted the valley protected more than he wanted one ranch standing on a broken foundation. The silence lasted a long time. Wren watched three brothers and their mother navigate a decision that would determine the shape of their lives, and she understood that this moment, more than the ballroom, more than the dinner party, more than the ambush or the blizzard, was the moment that mattered. This was where the truth either held or collapsed. You do not decide this alone, Levi said, his voice carrying an edge that Wren had never heard from him before. Not anymore. We are done with that. I agree, Breyer said. Then to Everett, I agree to let the ranch go. Not because you decided, because it is right. Everett looked at them, then at Wren. And you? What reason would you have to stay with three men who just gave away everything they own? Wren stood, walked around the table until she was standing in front of him, close enough to touch, close enough to see every fracture in the armor he had worn for 33 years. I walked through a blizzard for $2 a week, she said. I'm not here for the land. I'm not here for the money. I am here because for the first time in my life, I have a family, and family is not something measured in acres. She turned to Cordelia, and the word came out before she could think about it, natural as breathing, surprising them both. I want to stay, if you will have me. Cordelia looked at her for a long, searching moment. Then the older woman's eyes glistened, the first time Wren had ever seen moisture in those iron gray eyes, and she said, then stay. The solution when it came was Wren's. There is a third option, she said that evening, the four of them sitting around the fireplace in the positions that had become natural as breathing. Laurel Voss inherits her father's assets when he is convicted. That includes the controlling interest in First Mountain Bank, and it includes the $20,000 debt. You think Laurel will forgive the debt? Everett asked. I think Laurel wants to atone for what her father did. I think erasing the debt he used to trap your family is the most direct way to begin. And I think she will agree because she told me in Mrs. Finch's shop that she was tired of being the daughter of the man who ruins lives. Forgiving this debt does not just free us, it frees her. Wren was right. Laurel agreed to meet, agreed to forgive the debt, agreed to sell the bank's controlling interest to the Valley Farmers Cooperative at below market price, enough to fund her relocation to San Francisco, far from Montana, far from the shadow of her father's name, far from everything she needed to leave behind in order to become someone she could live with. The Kincaid Ranch was saved, the valley was saved, and three brothers who had spent 4 years carrying their father's legacy like a millstone around their necks looked at the future for the first time without seeing chains. The wedding took place the following Sunday. The church was full, every pew occupied, people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorway and pressing against the windows from outside because word had spread through the valley, the way word always spreads in small communities, fast and thorough, and carrying equal parts curiosity and hope. Judge Harlan Croft officiated, combining legal authority with the personal gravity of a man who had watched these boys grow up and had been waiting, though he would never say so publicly, for exactly this moment. Emmett Farrow and his family sat in the front row. His youngest daughter, 6 years old, carried a basket of dried wildflowers and wore an expression of solemn importance that suggested she understood she had been given a responsibility that mattered. Mrs. Finch was there. Even Victoria Graves, seated near the back, her expression complicated but no longer hostile, watching with the attention of a woman reassessing a judgment she had made too quickly. Three brothers waited at the altar, Everett in formal black hands clasped behind his back because they were shaking, and he did not want anyone to see, though Wren would see because Wren always saw the things he tried to hide. Levi beside him, smiling with the genuine warmth that had returned to his face over the past 5 weeks, and that he was no longer willing to conceal. Breyer on Everett's other side, standing straight as a column of forged steel, wearing a suit that was visibly uncomfortable, on a body built for leather and forged aprons, enduring the fabric without complaint, because the woman walking toward him was worth any amount of discomfort. When Wren appeared in the doorway, all three brothers went still. She wore ivory silk, simple, beautiful, Mrs. Finch had sewn it over 4 days and 3 nights, pouring 15 years of skill into every stitch, and the result was not a dress, but a declaration that the woman wearing it had come from nothing and built something that mattered, and that the nothing she came from was not a source of shame, but a testament to how far courage could carry a person when they refused to stop walking. Wren walked the aisle alone. No father to give her away, no family of blood to witness. But she was not alone. The entire community watched, and what they saw was not a fraud or a fortune hunter. What they saw was a woman who had stood down, a railroad magnate survived an ambush, weathered a storm in a mountain cabin, and helped save 24 families from ruin. And they rose to their feet as she passed, not because tradition demanded it, but because respect did. She reached the altar, took Everett's hand with her right, Levi's with her left. Briar stood close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, solid and warm and unwavering. Everett spoke his vows first. Ren, I brought you into this family through deception and desperation. I asked you to pretend. I gave you rules designed to prevent exactly what happened anyway. But somewhere in the middle of the performance, I found the most real thing I have ever known. You are brave where I am cautious, honest where I hide behind walls, strong where I am brittle. I love you not because of any contract, but because you chose to stay when every rational thought should have sent you running. I will spend the rest of my life earning that choice. Levi spoke next. Ren, I am the brother who talks too much and feels too deeply, and I have decided to stop apologizing for either one. You brought laughter back to a house that had forgotten what it sounded like. You taught me that home is not a place you live in. It is a person you come back to. I promise to be your comfort when the world is cold, your partner when the work is hard, and the first one to make you smile when everything seems impossible. Briar spoke last, slowly, each word chosen the way he chose iron for the forge, tested for strength, rejected if it was not sufficient, accepted only when it could bear the weight he needed it to carry. I do not have pretty words, never have. But I know this, before you came, I did not know what I was protecting. I built fences and forged gates and stood watch over land and cattle and timber, and none of it meant anything because I was guarding an empty house. Now I know it was always going to be you. I promise to keep you safe, not because you cannot protect yourself. You are the strongest person I have ever met, but because protecting you is the best thing I have ever done with these hands. Ren spoke her vows to all three of them, on Everett, Levi, Briar. You saw me when I was invisible. You gave me value when I had none. You asked me to pretend to love you, and somehow that pretending became the truest thing in my life. I am not here because of money or land or a contract written in desperate ink. I am here because when I look at you, all three of you, to see home, I see partnership. I see a future worth every mile I have ever walked and every storm I have ever survived. I promise to stand beside you in whatever comes next, to challenge you when you need it, to support you always, and to love each of you exactly as you are with everything I have, for as long as I am breathing. Judge Croft cleared his throat. By the power vested in me by Montana Territory and witnessed by this community, I pronounce you married, husband and wife. A pause, the slightest smile. Husbands and wife. Laughter rippled through the church, then applause. Then Everett kissed her gently, and she kissed him back, and it was not performance, and it was not fiction, and the entire church could see the difference. Levi pressed his lips to her forehead. Benediction. Promise, Mom. Briar took her hand and kissed her knuckles, one touch, one moment, everything he could not say, and everything he did not need to, because she already knew. The church erupted. The celebration stretched into the evening. Dancing and music and food, and the joy of a community that has survived something together and needs to remind itself that survival is worth celebrating. Ren danced with Everett, who was surprisingly graceful for a man built like a mountain. With Levi, who was graceful in the way of men who understood rhythm and movement as extensions of gentleness. With Briar, who danced badly and did not care because the woman in his arms was smiling, and that was the only metric that mattered. Cordelia held court near the refreshment table, accepting congratulations with the regal composure of a woman who had won a war she had never expected to fight, and the woman responsible for that victory was wearing ivory silk and laughing in a way that made the entire room feel warmer. As night settled over the valley, the four of them slipped outside to the porch. The air was cold and clean, and the stars were so thick they looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. Ren leaned against Everett's chest. Levi stood beside her shoulder, warm against hers. Briar rested against the porch railing, looking up at the sky with the quiet contentment of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for happiness without believing it would actually arrive, and who was now standing in the middle of it with no idea what to do next except stay exactly where he was. Tired? Everett asked. Exhausted, happy, overwhelmed. She looked up at him, still not entirely certain this is real. It is real, Levi said. No more contracts, no more performance, just us. Just us, she repeated. Briar turned from the stars. You walked through that blizzard hoping for $2 a week, he said, and you ended up with 3 mountain men who cannot agree on anything except you. That is not entirely accurate, Levi protested. We also agree that you cannot cook. I cook fine. You set the kitchen on fire last Tuesday. That was a controlled situation. There were actual flames, Briar. The curtains were involved. Wren laughed. Real, full, joyful laughter that rang across the Montana night and carried through the cold air and reached the valley below where 24 families were sleeping safely in their homes because 4 people had refused to let a powerful man take what did not belong to him. All 3 brothers stopped talking to watch her laugh, wearing identical expressions of wonder as though her happiness was the most extraordinary thing they had ever witnessed. What are you thinking? Everett asked. Wren looked at the ranch stretching into darkness, at the mountains rising against the stars, at 3 men who had started as strangers and become everything. I am thinking that I walked through a blizzard looking for survival, she said, and I found something so much better. What is that? Levi asked. Home. Everett pressed his lips to her temple. Levi squeezed her hand. Briar from his place at the railing said one word. Good. Inside, the last of the celebration was winding down. Tomorrow would bring new work. The ranch needed managing. The valley needed rebuilding. 17 families needed help recovering what had been taken from them, and the Kincaid brothers, who had nearly lost everything themselves, would be the first to offer it because that was what their father had built this ranch to be, not just a business but a foundation for a community, a place where people could come when they needed help and know they would not be turned away. And at the center of it all, holding it together the way thread holds fabric, was Wren. No longer Bellamy, no longer pretending, no longer invisible. A woman who had walked into a lie and turned it into the truest thing any of them had ever known. The door closed softly behind them as they went inside together. 4 people who had started with nothing but a desperate fiction and forged it through fire and storm, and the alchemy that happens when people choose each other against all odds and refuse to let go into something real. Something that would last. Something that the mountain, for all its cold and all its fury and all its patient, implacable power, could never take away. Because it had been forged in the mountain's own fire. And what the mountain forges, the mountain keeps.